Troops of George III have crossed the Atlantic not to engage an enemy, but to assist a band of traitors in trampling on the rights and liberties of his most loyal subjects. Some boast of being friends to government. I am a friend to righteous government, to a government founded upon the principles of reason and justice, but I glory in publicly avowing my eternal enmity to tyranny. These are the words of John Hancock spoken during the 1774 Boston Massacre commemoration at Faneuil Hall. While most today only know John Hancock for his name coming to be an expression when referring to one's signature, it turns out there was good reason his signature was the most prominent on the Declaration of Independence. Having risen from relatively humble origins to one of the wealthiest men in all of America, with a large part of his fortune depending on trade with Britain, when it was time to take sides, unlike so many of his elite contemporaries in his same boat, he curiously chose to sink his business and side with the rebels. Soon after, he was involved in a massive number of the early efforts against the British, from the Liberty Affair to the Boston Tea Party to being the principal reason for Paul Revere's famous ride. Soon after this, he was made president of the Continental Congress, with his business and management acumen in that role being a huge reason the rebellion was able to function in the early going. In that role, he was also the chief signer of the Declaration of Independence, later 9-time governor of Massachusetts, and overall one of the most well-known and popular men in all of America during his lifetime, with at one point his popularity with the masses combined with his extreme wealth, seeing the British mockingly nickname him King Hancock. Later, this moniker was taken up by the colonists as a term of endearment for the man, and even allegedly a rallying cry during the famous Battle of Lexington and Concord that kicked off the war. And yet, a funny thing happened after he died. Despite John Hancock being arguably one of the most critical of the revolutionaries in the first half of the affair, and his popularity with the masses of America being almost unparalleled in his lifetime, as noted, for a variety of reasons, popular history would very quickly mostly forget the man other than his famous signature. In fact, the first full biography on John Hancock wasn't even written until the 20th century, and it's only been in recent decades historians have started to completely reevaluate his story, given the significance of so much that he was involved in, and the rather silly reasons, from a modern perspective, that contributed to him being so quickly dismissed after his death. As one of the greatest founding fathers of them all, and John Adams would write a few decades after Hancock passed away, James Otis, Samuel Adams, and John Hancock were the three most essential characters in the Revolution, and Great Britain knew it, though America does not. Great and important and excellent characters aroused and excited by these arose in Pennsylvania, Virginia, New York, South Carolina, and in all other states. But these three were the first movers, the most constant, steady, persevering springs, agents, and most disinterested sufferers and firmest pillars of the whole revolution. With such high praise from a man who himself was arguably in the top 3 of shapers of the budding United States, I think it's time to get to know the individual he heaped such similar praise on. So without further ado, here now is the largely forgotten story of John Hancock, and we start with the rise of this merchant prince. Born on January 23, 1737, in a part of Braintree, Massachusetts, which would become present-day Quincy, John Hancock's life seemed destined to be relatively common. At the time of his birth, Braintree was comprised of only a few dozen families, though notably there was another baby there with Hancock, future President John Adams, who John Hancock's father baptized only about a year and a half before baptizing his own son. As to these baptisms, Hancock's father was one Reverend John Hancock Jr., a former Harvard graduate and librarian at that university who became a pastor at the United First Parish Church in Quincy several years before John Hancock was born. As a son and grandson of ministers, it seemed likely that the young boy himself would go on to become a minister, but it was not to be. You see, when he was a mere 7 years old, his father suddenly died at the age of just 41. With no real means of supporting her family, initially his mother, Mary, and siblings went to live with his grandfather, Bishop John Hancock Sr., in Lexington. As a brief aside, this home is where Paul Revere was initially heading to during his famous midnight ride just before the first shots of the American Revolution were fired. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Hancock's rise and then extremely prominent role in the Revolution likely would never have taken place if not for Bishop Hancock Sr.'s other son and John Hancock's uncle, Thomas Hancock. After leaving home at a mere 14 years old, Thomas initially worked as an apprentice bookseller and indentured servant to one Samuel Garish in Boston. 7 years later, he had completed his contract and thereafter opened his own bookstore. Not long after that, he started his own publishing house and later even a paper mill, which all ended up being extremely lucrative as Boston was, at the time, the central hub for publishing among the colonies. From here, Thomas expanded into wholesaling, then commodity bartering, next up investment banking, shipping, and beyond, among other things importing or exporting everything from rum, fish, whale oil, and various manufactured goods. Over the course of almost 3 decades, building up an extremely prominent mercantile business known as the House of Hancock. The only problem in all of this was that Thomas and his wife Lydia, despite being married for many years, had no children of their own, and he was desirous of an heir. Naturally, with John Hancock's father now dead, an arrangement was struck between the bishop, Mary, and Thomas. Thomas would support John's mother and siblings, and John would be sent to live with Thomas and Lydia at their estate at the top of Beacon Hill, where they would train him to someday take over the family business, making John the heir of one of the largest fortunes in the colonies. Naturally, this agreement being extremely beneficial to all involved, the deal was struck and Thomas took John to his home and his training began. First in the still prominent to this day Boston Public Latin School, which in Hancock's time was already starting to be distinguished by such students as Benjamin Franklin, and would ultimately be the school that 5 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence would attend. Hancock would study for 5 years there before at the age of 13 in 1750, he took and passed the entrance exam for Harvard. Noteworthy during his time at Harvard, he also met up with one of his former friends who was attending at the same time, John Adams. Unlike the rigid Adams, however, the young teen Hancock apparently had a reputation as a bit of a partier and drinker while at Harvard, including getting occasionally severely reprimanded for it. But nevertheless, at the age of 17, he graduated and was ready for the next stage of his education, working directly under his uncle at the House of Hancock, both learning business and being shaped into a prominent socialite among the elite. While Hancock had seemingly not taken his studies too seriously at Harvard, relatively speaking anyway, now with his true future profession in sight, his attitude seemed to shift remarkably, quickly becoming not just a master of finance and business, but reportedly extremely good with negotiation and that side of the business as well, and in general was noted for his extremely charismatic demeanor. John Adams would later write of this and Hancock's work ethic that he quickly became an example to all the young men of the town. Wholly devoted to business, he was as regular and punctual at his store as the sun in its course. Along the way, he also took to being one of the best-dressed men in all of America. From his bob wig to his velvet coats and ruffled shirts down to his silver-buckled shoes, he was the picture of an 18th century dandy who would have fit in with the best and most foppishly dressed in the courts of European aristocracy. This fact would somewhat bizarrely shape how history would view him, as we'll get into. In any event, thanks to the 7 Years' War and the House of Hancock's heavy involvement in that in finance and military supplies on the side of the British, the firm was vaulted to even greater heights. When the conflict was over in 1760, the 23-year-old John Hancock was sent to England for about a year on a mission to establish closer ties with various individuals there for the company. A final test for the young man by his uncle, with his work up to this point exemplary. On this, Thomas wrote to some of his business associates that when John returned, if all went well, he intended to make him a full partner in the firm. As for John, Thomas wrote and advised him to be frugal of expenses, do honor to your country, and furnish your mind with all wise improvements. God bless you, and believe me, your loving uncle. Hancock was seemingly blown away by London and all it offered, as well as just its sheer size and extreme populace of over 700,000 people. For reference here, at the time, Boston had a mere 15,000 people, and the largest in the colonies, Philadelphia, wasn't much greater at 19,000. Soaking it all up, Hancock traveled around on business both locally in England and to Amsterdam, among other places. He also was there around the time of the coronation of King George III. But when he requested to stay longer to attend the coronation, unfortunately, all was not well back home. While the business was prospering to an extreme degree, Thomas had grown ill thanks to occasional severe bouts with gout and some form of nervous disorder. Thus, he denied John's request to allow him to stay to see the king crowned, and not long after wrote to his company's countless business associates that he was making John a partner in the House of Hancock, and began the process of stepping back from day-to-day operations in favor of letting John spearhead things. A little over a year and a half later, on August 1st, 1764, Thomas Hancock had a stroke and died. While Thomas made many philanthropic bequests and deeded his mansion and household slaves to his wife, Though noteworthy, John Hancock would later free these slaves not long after himself inheriting them after his aunt's death. Thomas also left the majority of his fortune to his nephew. As to the size of the estate at this point, this was estimated to be over £70,000, diversified in everything from ships, real estate, interest-bearing loans, and the like. While there is no good way to translate that amount to modern dollars, for at least one reference point, a few years earlier, Thomas Hancock had sold a large estate he owned in Lexington for only £476. And so it was that the 27-year-old John Hancock was now one of the richest men in all of America, head of one of the most prominent firms in the colonies, and fully trained up to vault the House of Hancock to even greater heights, which he did do at first, but larger concerns soon interrupted all of this. As John Adams would write, not less than 1,000 families were every day in the year dependent on Mr. Hancock for their daily bread. Consider his real estate in Boston, in the country, in Connecticut, and the rest of New England. Had Mr. Hancock fallen asleep to this day, he would now awake one of the richest men. Had he persevered in business as a private merchant, he might have erected a house of Medicis. But no man's property was ever more entirely devoted to the public. On this, with extremely close business ties in England and otherwise a loyal British subject, at this point everything was set up for Hancock to be a staunch loyalist in the upcoming conflict. Things would begin to shift, however, thanks to a handful of acts put forth by the rather deeply in-depth British government, such as the Sugar Act of 1764. This was more or less just an updated version of the Molasses Act of 1733, which was passed not so much to actually collect any taxes on the lucrative molasses trade in the colonies, but rather to try to kill trade from the French West Indies at the behest of the plantation owners of the British West Indies. The issue for the colonists is this would also have simultaneously killed such things as their lucrative rum industry. So instead of adhering to the Molasses Act, they simply took to mass smuggling and bribing of officials. The Sugar Act, in contrast, was actually meant to collect revenue, and thus they lowered the tax rate by half from the Molasses Act and increased provisions and personnel to try to make sure they could actually collect on it. As for why Parliament thought the colonists should be subjected to such a tax, after the 7 Years' War, Britain's national debt had almost doubled as a result, and in the aftermath they'd also decided that they needed to keep a standing army in the colonies of about 10,000 soldiers. But not exactly flush with cash, they needed a way to pay for them and felt that because the soldiers were, in part, there for the colonists' protection, they should, in turn, pay for them partially through this tax. Naturally, the colonists, who generally resented to an extreme degree the presence of the British Army for various reasons, even at that point, and wanted them gone, did not agree. Further, this tax hit right when something of an economic depression was occurring in the colonies in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War. Then, of course, there was the principle of the thing. Samuel Adams would sum up the colonists' argument against the act: "For if our trade may be taxed, why not our lands? Why not the produce of our lands and everything we possess or make use of? If taxes are laid upon us in any shape without our having a legal representation where they are laid, are we not reduced from the character of free subjects to the miserable state of tributary slaves?" As a brief aside here, as was alluded to in our previous quote from John Adams about the three most important pillars of the Revolution, Samuel Adams is another interesting character oft forgotten today without whom there may have been no revolution, with his countless letters and articles published in the newspapers throughout the colonies spurring the masses towards this, among so much else he was involved with in the early goings, similar to John Hancock. And in fact, Samuel Adams is generally credited as being the one to convince John Hancock of the right of the Patriot cause in the first place. As to why he's often forgotten, there are several factors that went into this, but John Adams would ring in hinting at one of the issues. Because so much of Samuel Adams's writings and contributions in this way were lost or not credited to him. This was partially because, for reasons of not wanting to get hung, he published so much anonymously. And with regards to his personal correspondence with so many involved in the Revolution, he also had a habit of burning all his letters. This was something that John Adams would try to dissuade him from for posterity's sake, but when he asked Samuel Adams why he burned them, given the cost to the historical record and to himself in this, Samuel replied, "Whatever becomes of me, my friends shall never suffer by my negligence." In a nutshell, if the British got their hands on his correspondence, it may not just be Samuel Adams who would hang. But in any event, going back to the taxes, the water got even hotter with the passage of the Stamp Act in 1765, which put a tax on various legal documents and, unlike with smuggling, was mostly impossible to get around, as any such legal document not possessing the required stamp was not valid. Despite the grumblings from the colonists about this, across the pond, Member of Parliament Charles Townshend argued more or less that the colonists should get over it, stating, "And now with these Americans, children planted by our care, nourished by our indulgence until they are grown to a degree of strength and opulence, and protected by our arms, will they grudge to contribute their mite to relieve us from heavy weight of the burden which we lie under?" To which Member of Parliament, 7 years war veteran and alleged coiner of the term Sons of Liberty, in this very speech, Colonel Isaac Barry, would respond, "They planted by your care? No, your oppression planted them in America. They fled from your tyranny to a then uncultivated and unhospitable country where they exposed themselves to almost all the hardships to which human nature is liable. They, nourished by your indulgence, they grew by your neglect of them. As soon as you began to care about them, that care was exercised in sending persons to rule over them in one department and another, sent to spy out their liberty, to misrepresent their actions, and to prey upon them. Men whose behavior on many occasions has caused the blood of those sons of liberty to recoil with them. They, protected by your arms, they have nobly taken up arms in your defense, have exerted a valor amidst their constant and laborious industry for the defense of the country whose frontier, while drenched in blood, its interior parts have yielded all its little savings to your emolument. The people, I believe, are as truly loyal as any subjects the king has, but a people jealous of their liberties and who will vindicate them if ever they should be violated." Colonel Barry's warnings, however, were not listened to, and Parliament persisted. Going back to Hancock's view of all this, while seemingly sympathetic to those opposing these acts and having spoken out against such taxes, Hancock initially attempted to stay mostly neutral in all of it, writing, "I am heartily sorry for the great burden laid upon us. We are not able to bear all things, but must submit to higher powers." Reflecting his desire to more or less stay out of it, he would also write to the governor when asked of his opinions, "I seldom meddle with politics, and indeed have not time now to say anything on that head." However, when mobs in Boston started targeting wealthy merchants in their homes, he finally had to pick a side, though not the one most in his position did. He not only threw his public support behind the protesters, but helped to fund their efforts too. On the former, for example, proclaiming at the Stamp Act Congress of 1765 in New York, "I will not be a slave. I have the right to the liberties and privileges of the English Constitution, and I, as an Englishman, will enjoy them." Despite the extreme negative impact on his business, he also joined in with countless others in boycotting British goods. On top of this, he also began writing to his many prominent business associates in England, asking them to put pressure on Parliament to repeal the act. For one example, he writes, "Our trade will entirely stagnate, for it is the united resolution and determination of the people here not to carry on business under a stamp. I now tell you, you will find it come to pass that the people of this country will never suffer themselves to be made slaves of by a submission to that damned act. But I shall now open to you my own determinations. It is my invariable opinion that this act is unconstitutional and cruel, the expense of which we are not able to support. That I have come to a serious resolution not to send one ship more to sea, nor to have any kind of connection in business under a stamp. I am determined, as soon as I know that they are resolved to insist on this act, to sell my stock in the trade and shut up my warehouse doors. I am free and determined to be so. I will not willingly and quietly subject myself to slavery. We are a people worthy of saving, and our trade so much to your advantage worth keeping on your side. This much I thought to mention to you to let you see some of the ill consequences of this act, and they are what will greatly affect Great Britain in the end, and trade, once lost, is not easily retrieved. Your sincere friend, but an enemy to the stamps, John Hancock." Ultimately, their protesting efforts were successful, and the Stamp Act was repealed after only 4 months. Important to the story at hand today on John Hancock's rise in the nation, it wasn't just repealed, but news of the repeal was brought by one of Hancock's own ships, leading some to believe that Hancock had played an even more prominent role than he actually did. His popularity locally was also boosted when, in the aftermath, he held a massive party for all in the town to celebrate. As reported in a local paper, John Hancock, Esquire, who gave a grand and elegant entertainment to the genteel part of the town and treated the populace with a pipe of Madeira wine, erected at the front of his house, which was magnificently illuminated, a stage for the exhibition of fireworks, which was to answer those of the Sons of Liberty. At dusk, the scene opened by the discharge of 12 rockets from each stage, after which the figures on the pyramid were uncovered, making a beautiful appearance. To give a description of the great variety of fireworks exhibited from this time till 11 o'clock would be endless. The air was filled with rockets, the ground with beehives and serpents, and the 2 stages with wheels of fireworks of various sorts. At 11 o'clock, the signal being given for a discharge of 21 rockets, the horizontal wheel on the top of the pyramid or obelisk was played off, ending in the discharge of 6 dozen of serpents in the air, which concluded the show. Noteworthy in accounts of this party and aftermath is that none other than Paul Revere gets a mention, having engraved the obelisk. Thanks to Hancock's popularity and now openness to become involved in politics for the first time, in May of 1766 he was elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives. His popularity would only rise further with significant continued philanthropy with the local populace, from substantial donations to a variety of local churches, to distributing firewood to the poor in winter, to occasionally abstaining from collecting rent from among his tenants who were struggling, to regular free concerts and entertainment for the community, to public service improvements to the town common, including walkways, trees, and hundreds of street lamps. He also around this time began serving on dozens of local committees and just in general had a great reputation for being generous to everyone, right down to when a fire broke out in a local bakehouse, he gave funds to the individuals affected to rebuild it. This was something he and his uncle had frequently seemingly done as a matter of course, such as when a fire had previously spread throughout the town in 1760, making many of his tenants and others homeless. House of Hancock's response was to distribute a large sum of money among those who were affected to help them recover from the ordeal. As John Adams would state of Hancock, if benevolence, charity, generosity were ever personified in a North American, they were in John Hancock. Not just this, but he also throughout all of this became an even bigger employer in the region. As colonial governor Thomas Hutchinson would note, Hancock changed the course of his uncle's business and built and employed in trade a great number of ships, and in this way, by building at this time several houses, he found work for a great number of tradesmen. Made himself popular, was chosen selectman, representative, moderator of the town meetings, etc. On top of this, he was once again noted as being extremely charismatic and despite his high station in life, had a strong reputation for treating commoners no differently than he did his fellow elites, something that wasn't exactly the norm at the time. Needless to say, despite being among the wealthiest in America at the time, with most of such ilk not exactly always seen in the best light by the masses, John Hancock was an exception, and he was about to get massively more popular outside of his home turf. You see, still trying to drum up funds from the colonies and seemingly not getting the message with the escalating protests of the previous taxes, Parliament decided to try a different tack and just pass a bunch of them in rapid succession, known collectively as the Townshend Acts. In response, Samuel Adams issued a circular letter making the formal argument that because the colonists were not represented in Parliament, that issuing such taxes on them violated the British Constitution. In response to this, Secretary of State for the Colonies, Lord Hillsborough, ordered the Massachusetts court to revoke the letter, to which the court responded in a landslide vote of 92 to 17 for Lord Hillsborough to shut up and mind his own business, denying his request. In response to that, Governor Francis Bernard went ahead and prorogued the assembly. Naturally, temporarily taking away the only legal way for the colonists to protest meant they were left with only illegal ways. Unsurprisingly, the situation began to further deteriorate, and John Hancock was about to be at the center of it. Now, being one of the largest importers and exporters in the colonies, and smuggling being exceedingly common as noted, and even more so now with the additional taxes, House of Hancock was certainly suspected of smuggling, though no proof was forthcoming. Nevertheless, on April 9, 1768, customs officials boarded one of Hancock's recently arrived ships, the Lydia, sitting in Boston Harbor. Nothing amiss with that, just doing their job. However, one of the officials, Owen Richards, further attempted to search the hold of the vessel. When Hancock was alerted of this and finding that the agents had no writ of assistance authorizing them to search his ship, with their prerogative only to observe what was loaded or unloaded, He and his men forcibly and under arms removed Richard from the hold and made he and his companion remain on the deck only. As a result of this rough treatment, the officials attempted to take legal action against Hancock, but Attorney General Jonathan Sewall rejected their pleas, noting Hancock had not actually broken any laws here. That said, they then appealed to the commissioners in England to overrule Sewall, but before a reply could be had on the matter, they'd be satisfied with trying to go after Hancock in a different way. Noteworthy this first event though, as the customs agents were physically removed from the hold, this is sometimes claimed to be the first physical violence against British officials in the Revolution. Whatever the case there, let's just say the masses on the colonist side thought even higher of Hancock after this, not only because he was allegedly smuggling goods to avoid paying the deemed unjust taxes, but essentially giving the finger to the customs agents trying to inspect and catch him at it. But going back to going after Hancock in a different way, enter the Liberty Affair, which in turn, through a sequence of events partially as a result of it, all ultimately led to the Boston Massacre. On all this, on May the 9th, 1768, Hancock's ship, the Liberty, arrived in Boston Harbor in the evening carrying a shipment of Madeira wine, Hancock's personal favorite, only to be inspected the morning after its arrival by customs collectors Joseph Harrison and Benjamin Hollowell, who found that about 3/4 of the ship's hold was completely empty. While this was suspicious, 2 other customs agents had been on the ship all night since its arrival and in sworn statements stated that nothing had been taken from the ship. Noteworthy is that these agents were extremely incentivized to reveal any smuggling activity, as they would be granted 1/3 of the value of the smuggled goods if they could catch someone doing this. But in this case, with the customs agents claiming nothing was taken off the ship, despite much of the hold being empty, nothing was to be done despite the raised eyebrows. Hancock paid his taxes on what was there, and seemingly the matter was resolved. That is, until about a month later, one of the customs agents who'd been aboard the Liberty all night after its arrival, Thomas Kirk, would claim there had actually been cargo unloaded in the night, and the only reason he hadn't said anything was that the captain of the ship, John Marshall, had threatened he would be killed if he ever uttered a word about it. He further claimed that while he'd not seen the cargo himself, for about 3 hours of the night in question, he was locked in the steerage, but while there, he had, to quote, heard a noise as of many people on deck at work hoisting out goods. As for the other customs official aboard, he allegedly got drunk or otherwise just fell asleep and so could not confirm or deny events. And as for Captain Marshall's account, well, he had died in the interim, so could not testify. In a June 22nd, 1768 news article, it was thus reported what happened next. Wednesday the 17th, the Honorable Robert Ashmudi, Esquire, Judge of Admiralty for this province, decreed the sloop Liberty seized the 10th of June last to be forfeited, but the 200 barrels oil and 6 barrels tar, which were on board her when seized, were cleared. As for this cargo, it had allegedly been put aboard for storage as the warehouses on the wharf were overfull, something that was technically illegal without a permit, but was a common practice in the harbor at the time. Noteworthy, it's sometimes suggested, given the loss of some of the records of the initial charges, that the reason for the seizing of the ship and why Hancock never got it back may have been partially for this lack of permit to have these goods on board. Even though, if that was the case, they could have just as well seized most of the ships in the harbor for the same. Whatever the case there, Hancock was accused of having had the ship illegally unloaded in the night. He was then arrested, and as noted in the news report, the Liberty impounded. After a bit of wrangling over the matter, Hancock eventually was allowed to put up a 3,000-pound bond to avoid being imprisoned, which was a good thing as the affair would drag out for many months after. As for the public response, well, this was the last straw. At the time, the masses were not just upset about the taxes, but also the presence of the relatively recently arrived HMS Romney as its captain, one John Corner, had been impressing colonists to forcibly serve in the British Navy, with Corner arguing it was totally fine because he would not take any belonging to or married in the province, nor any employed in the trade along shore or to the neighboring colonies. Such a reasonable fellow, can't imagine why they were upset about it. Beyond the obvious issues, Captain Corner's activities were also deterring some merchant vessels from wanting to dock in Boston Harbor for fear of losing members of their crews to the British Navy via this impressment, and even many locals began avoiding the harbor for similar reasons. Thus, when the Liberty was being seized and the popular individual in Hancock, who employed hundreds of people in the region as well, was arrested, the gathered crowd witnessing the seizing of the ship was forming into a mob. but ultimately prevented from acting owing to the presence of the Romney and its guns pointed very much at them while all this was happening. Not able to do anything to stop the seizing of the ship or arrest of Hancock, they instead turned to taking their ire out on local custom officials themselves. One of the customs officials, the aforementioned Joseph Harrison, would later testify they swarmed he and his son. The onset was begun by throwing dirt at me, which was presently succeeded by volleys of stones, brickbats, sticks, or anything that came to hand. In this manner, I ran the gauntlet near 200 yards. My poor son was knocked down and then laid hold of by the legs, arms, and the hair of his head, and in that manner dragged. Later that night, the mob convened on his home and, finding him very wisely not there, proceeded to ransack it. They then took Harrison's pleasure boat, pulled it from the water, and burned it in the streets. Harrison, his family, and other customs officials were thus forced to flee and lodge in Castle William, now called Fort Independence, for protection. The local populace continued to seethe over it all, and finally 4 regiments of redcoats were eventually dispatched to Boston to keep the peace and protect the British officials in the town. The Journal of the Times would report on October 1st, 1768, at about 1 o'clock, all the troops landed under cover of the cannon of the ships of war and marched into the common with muskets charged, bayonets fixed, colors flying, drums beating, and fifes, etc. playing. While this had the desired effect of keeping order in the immediate, in the long term, what was considered more or less an occupying army most decidedly had the opposite effect of keeping the peace. Going back to the trial, as mentioned, at the time the government officials were actually incentivized to find Hancock guilty, as in so doing, any penalties that would be levied against him would be partially awarded to not just the crown, but the governor and Hancock's accusers. On top of this, the trial was to have no jury and did not allow the defense to cross-examine the witnesses either. In need of a very good lawyer, Hancock turned to his old friend, none other than future US President John Adams, to defend him. Adams would write of this, "Mr. Hancock thought fit to engage me as his counsel and advocate, and a painful drudgery I had of his cause. There were few days through the whole winter when I was not summoned to attend the court of admiralty. It seemed as if the officers of the crown were determined to examine the whole town as witnesses. Almost every day a fresh witness was to be examined upon interrogatories. They interrogated many of his near relations and most intimate friends and threatened to summon his amiable and venerable aunt. I was thoroughly weary and disgusted with the court, the officers of the crown, the cause, and even with the tyrannical bell that dongled me out of my house every morning." Adams' defense of Hancock centered around a few things. First, by British law, conviction based on testimony required more than one credible witness, which the court didn't have, despite their sincerest efforts interviewing countless individuals. He also argued of the one witness they did have, that any witness who was to benefit from the conviction could not be trusted, and that, to quote, "indigent persons and beggars ought to be suspected because they are easily corrupted." Second, that even if it were proved wine or other cargo had been unloaded illegally, the court did not have any evidence that Hancock himself was involved in any of it, nor was there any proof he had any knowledge of such activities. With Adams writing, that is the owner either concerned or assisting in it if he does not know of it? He may be asleep in his bed and not so much as know or dream that anybody is unshipping and landing his wines. Can it be proved that Captain Marshall asked leave of Mr. Hancock? Can it be proved that Mr. Hancock knew of this frolic? If he neither consented to it nor knew of it, how can he be liable to the penalty? Adams further argued that even if it could be proved wine had been illegally unloaded, and even if it could be proved that Hancock had been complicit in this, seizing the ship and its cargo, and then on top of that requiring Hancock to pay a substantial sum if convicted, was disproportionate to the crime, stating, "The degree of severity in any penal laws is to be determined only by the proportion between the crime and the punishment. Treason is justly punished with death because it is an attempt to overthrow the whole frame of the government, and the government can never be overturned without the slaughter of many hundreds of lives and the ruin of many thousands of fortunes. If a man will murder his fellow subject, it seems but equal that he should lose his own life. But in this case, what is the crime? Landing a few casks of wine, admitting the crown to have the clearest right to the duties, it is but unjustly taking away a small sum of money from the crown, and one would think that the forfeiture of 100 pounds would be an equal punishment for withholding 100 in duties. But surely the forfeiture of the whole cargo of wines, worth 10,000 pounds, for withholding 100 pounds in duties would be a great disproportion between the crime and the punishment. To carry it one step further and subject the ship as well as the cargo to confiscation, but above all to subject the master to 1,000 pounds and every person concerned to a forfeiture of treble the value, is such a stretch of security as renders this act more penal than any statute versus robbery, murder, or treason. Next up, Adams vehemently argued that similar offenses in England would allow the defendant a jury trial, something Hancock was not being offered, which, to quote, degraded Hancock below the rank of an Englishman. And that, I argue that if we are to be governed by the rules of the common law, we ought to adopt it as a whole and summon a jury and be tried by Magna Carta. Every examination of witnesses ought to be in open court, in presence of the parties, face to face, and there ought to be regular adjournments from one time to another. What other hypothesis shall we assume? Shall we say that we are to be governed by some rules of the common law and some rules of the civil law, that the judge at his discretion should choose out of each system such rules as please him and discard the rest? After many months of apparently daily deliberations, whether via Adams's arguments or simply that the state perhaps was concerned what would happen if they convicted Hancock with no real evidence, the matter was dropped, with it simply noted in the court records of March the 25th, 1769, the Advocate General prays leave to retract this information and says our sovereign lord the king will prosecute no further hereon. No further explanation was given as to why they gave up the case, nor is it fully clear why the Liberty was never returned to Hancock, and we'll get into its interesting fate shortly, because what she would be put to use for pissed off the colonists even further. But for now, you might be wondering if Hancock actually did have wine smuggled off the ship in the night, or even was involved in smuggling. Well, in the general case, there has never been any known hard evidence that the House of Hancock under John Hancock took part in any smuggling, although as noted, it was an extremely common practice at the time, and particularly given Hancock's stance on these taxes, and it almost being deemed downright patriotic to smuggle goods under the British officials' noses, it would not be surprising for one of the biggest importers and patriots in the region to have been involved in such activities. And indeed, today you'll find no shortage of claims that Hancock did, even sometimes specific figures like smuggling over 1 million tons of molasses per year. Although where these figures came from, especially as the smugglers weren't stupid enough to leave documented evidence of any of it, is not clear. As for this specific case, it's likewise unclear if Hancock was smuggling wine here, and given a letter Hancock had previously sent requesting the wine, it even seems like maybe the hold was mostly just empty because the main point of the wine was for Hancock himself, and any extra for wider sale was just if there was some available at the time. For example, in a letter dated November the 12th, 1767, Hancock requested the Liberty bring 4 pipes of the very best Madeira wine that you can possibly procure from my own table. I don't stand for price if it be good. I like a rich wine, and if you can ship a pipe of a right sterling old Madeira, pale and good, you will add it. I like pale wine, but I need say no more than that they are for my own use, and I beg they may be the very best that can be purchased. I pray distinguish them from any other on board by some private mark acquainting me thereof in your letter. I am also to desire you will please to ship me by the same vessel 6 pipes of good saleable Madeira wine for our market. I would not have them of too inferior quality. You will also ship by my sloop 2 pipes more of the best Madeira consigned to me. They are for the treasure of our province, and you will please to let them be good. If you or your friends have any wine or freight to ship this way, I should be obliged for you to give my vessel the preference, and you will please to receive this as a standing order to ship me an annual pipe of the very best Madeira wine. Thus, it may well be that they were simply fulfilling his personal request and didn't have much else to send to fill out the hold. Or maybe they did and he had it all smuggled off. Whatever the case there, with the help of Samuel Adams writing countless articles for papers throughout the colonies helping to cover the trial and seeming injustice in it, John Hancock's fame and popularity continued its meteoric rise among the colonists. As for the fate of the Liberty, it was initially put up for sale by the British officials, but no one would deign to buy it, so ultimately the Customs Commission fitted it out to be a revenue cutter to patrol for anyone attempting to bypass customs via smuggling. Naturally, the now very ironically named Liberty being used for this incensed people further, and just a few months into its new life as a revenue cutter, on July the 19th, 1769, the Liberty seized 2 ships apparently involved in smuggling and brought them into Newport. But once there, the captain of one of those ships, Joseph Packwood, with a mob of disgruntled colonists behind him, decided it was time to put an end to liberty. As reported in the Journal of the Times on August 1st, 1769, a number of persons, exasperated at the imprudent behavior of the captain and some of his people, went on board her as she lay at anchor, cut the cable, let her drift ashore, and then set her on fire. With the occupying troops still stationed in Boston to keep order and the populace of that city seething, this was just the beginning. But Hancock's name was now on the map as a potential leader of the conflict to come. At this stage, however, almost no one was talking of actual revolution, seemingly just wanting their rights respected. But soon, everything would change. This all now brings us to the next stage of Hancock's life in the Revolution, when a relatively rapid sequence of events in Massachusetts further inflamed the masses and, finally, ignited the American Revolution. Our story today begins about a year after Hancock's sea ship the Liberty was run ashore and burned to cinders by disgruntled colonists. At this point, tensions were still extremely high in the region, in no small part thanks to Boston still being host to the British soldiers sent there to keep order in the aftermath of the Liberty affair. Beyond the obvious reasons the colonists wouldn't appreciate this, the soldiers were also actively competing for jobs with the locals, and on top of that were being used to enforce the practice of impressment, wherein men of fighting age were abducted and forced to serve in the Royal Navy. Needless to say, by the spring of 1770, clashes between soldiers and civilians were on the rise. In one such incident, on March the 2nd, an employee at John Gray's rope walk, which made cables for sailing ships, asked a passing soldier, "Do you want work?" When the soldier replied that he did, the employee shot back, "Well then, get and clean my house." The irate soldier later returned with a dozen comrades and a violent fistfight broke out. But this was child's play compared to what was coming next. 3 days later, on March the 5th, British Army Captain John Goldfinch was walking down King Street when Edward Garrick, a wigmaker's apprentice, burst out of his shop and declared, "There goes the fellow who hath not paid my master for dressing his hair." When Goldfinch ignored him and kept walking, Garrick gave chase, insisting to bystanders that Goldfinch owed him money. A nearby British sentry named Hugh White overheard the argument and confronted Garrick, insisting that Goldfinch is a gentleman and if he owed you anything, he will pay for it. Garrick spat back that there are no gentlemen left in the regiment, leading to a violent argument and White striking Garrick with his musket butt, knocking him to the ground. The commotion soon drew a large crowd who began taunting White with cries of "bloody lobster back" and pelting him with snowballs and chunks of ice. Fearing for his life, White retreated from his sentry box to the steps of the nearby customs house, loaded his musket, and began waving it about, warning the crowd to stay back. When the crowd only continued to grow and close in, he banged his musket on the custom house door and steps and cried out, "Turn out, main guard!" Meanwhile, a few blocks north, a completely different mob had gathered and began pelting a group of soldiers with snowballs, forcing them to retreat into their barracks. This mob had gathered in response to rumors that the British planned to cut down Liberty Tree, an elm tree in South Boston which had been hung with effigies of people who had supported the Stamp Act. Upon learning of the situation unfolding at the customs house, this mob, some 200 strong, began marching towards King Street to join the other mob, chanting "Let's away" to the main guard as they went. News of the rapidly deteriorating situation soon reached Captain Thomas Preston, officer of the day at the main guard barracks. In this, Preston faced a difficult dilemma. If he did not act, Hugh White might be killed or severely injured by the mob. But if he intervened, he risked facing down a mob that greatly outnumbered his own forces. Critically for he and his men's safety, the law forbade him from opening fire on civilians without direct orders from a magistrate. After vacillating on it, Preston finally made up his mind, rounding up his men with the cry of "Turn out, damn your bloods, turn out!" With fixed bayonets, Captain Preston and 7 men marched out of their barracks and pushed their way through the gathered mob to Private White, still trapped on the steps of the custom house. But when they attempted to march back to the barracks, the mob closed in tighter, pelting them with snowballs, lumps of coal, oyster shells, and other missiles. Preston ordered the crowd to disperse, but was ignored. It was then that Crispus Attucks, 47-year-old mixed-race whaler and stevedore, burst from the crowd, grabbed Private Hugh Montgomery's musket, and knocked him to the ground. Montgomery immediately scrambled to his feet, cried out, "Damn you, fire!" and discharged his musket into the crowd. After a short pause, reported by witnesses as anywhere between 6 seconds and 2 minutes, the other soldiers also opened fire on the crowd. By the time Captain Preston yelled, "Stop firing! Do not fire!" 5 men lay dead or dying. Crispus Attucks, ropemaker Samuel Gray, mariner James Caldwell, apprentice ivory turner Samuel Maverick, and leatherworker Patrick Carr. 6 others were seriously wounded, including shipwright's apprentice Christopher Monk, who eventually died of his wounds in 1780. In the aftermath, future President John Adams, who in our aforementioned video Hancock, Rise of the Merchant Prince, would defend his boyhood friend John Hancock against the British in the Liberty Affair, would this time seemingly oddly choose the other side. As to why, it was merely the principle of the thing. Adams wanted to make sure the soldiers got a fair trial and saw the affair as an opportunity to demonstrate that the colonists could conduct themselves properly according to the rule of law and were worthy of independence and self-government. He thus readily accepted the case, charging a modest fee of only 18 guineas for his extensive services. Given tensions of the time and very real mob justice rampant, which is why the soldiers were there in the first place, this placed himself and his family at extreme personal risk, as well as, for all he knew at that point, would see his reputation ruin as the man who not only sided with the British, but seemingly murderers. As for his wife Abigail, Adams would write on March the 5th, 1773, that his equally principled other half gave him her full support. That excellent lady who has always encouraged me burst into a flood of tears, but said she was very sensible of the dangers to her and to our children as well as to me, but she thought I had done as I ought. She was very willing to share in all that was to come and place her trust in Providence. In the end, after a lengthy trial, the jury took only a few hours to reach a verdict. On December the 5th, 1770, exactly 9 months to the day after the massacre, all 8 defendants were acquitted of murder, while 2, Privates Matthew Kilroy and Hugh Montgomery, were convicted of a lesser charge of manslaughter. However, Adams was able to spare them imprisonment by invoking something of a loophole known as the benefit of the clergy. Adams would sum up after the soldiers were acquitted, "The part I took in the defense of Captain Preston and the soldiers procured me anxiety and obloquy enough. It was, however, one of the best pieces of service I ever rendered my country. Judgment of death against those soldiers would have been as foul a stain upon this country as the executions of the Quakers or witches anciently. As the evidence was, the verdict of the jury was exactly right." Going back to Adams's childhood friend and John Hancock, while Hancock wasn't involved in the Boston Massacre itself, in the aftermath he led a committee in demanding Governor Thomas Hutchinson order the removal of the British soldiers in Boston, with Hancock threatening the governor that if they were not removed, over 10,000 armed colonists would make them leave. The governor finally relented, and so it was that Boston was finally mostly free of its occupying force, who were sent to Castle William, today Fort Independence, on Castle Island in Boston Harbor. The good news only got better for the colonists when around the same time, much like it happened when the Stamp Act was repealed, as noted in our previous video in this series, the message that most of the Townshend Acts were repealed arrived on one of John Hancock's ships in April of 1770, with Hancock himself getting to reveal this fact at a town meeting. Combined with his extremely generous and charismatic nature, as well as the fact that Hancock had sent a number of letters to Parliament protesting the acts, and sent similar letters to many of his extremely wealthy business associates in Britain asking them to put pressure on Parliament to revoke them, and helping to get the soldiers removed from the town, let's just say a more beloved man in Boston you'd be hard-pressed to find at this point. And speaking of being beloved, now at 33 years old and one of the wealthiest people in all of America, Hancock's Aunt Lydia was set on finding him a suitable wife, though at this point having long been unsuccessful despite countless prominent families she'd had over with their very eligible daughters. Before this, Hancock's love life seemingly centered around having courted for nearly a decade the daughter of Captain Joseph Jackson, but he ultimately broke off the relationship for reasons unclear. After this, he also is known to have had a longtime mistress and a shop owner at the wharf, one Dorcas Griffith, who allegedly also on the side before and after becoming Hancock's mistress, had a lively alternate trade catering to men of the region with more than just her shop wares. However, the two had some sort of falling out for unknown reasons, though it is speculated to be centered around her support of the British side of things, given that when the British left, so did she. Whatever the case there, Hancock's Aunt Lydia finally was successful in finding a girl Hancock was interested in marrying in the 23-year-old daughter of one of Hancock's former neighbors as a child in Braintree, Justice Edmund Quincy. Quincy's daughter Dorothy, nicknamed Dolly, caught Hancock's eye when Lydia invited her to come vacation with Hancock and her, which went very well, and the two were soon affianced. While all this was happening, Hancock was also elected to the governor's council, something that had happened before, but owing to Hancock's opposition to much of the governing activities, the governor had previously vetoed Hancock's election. This time, however, in an attempt to woo Hancock over to his side and bury the hatchet, the governor approved it. That said, Hancock himself declined the position, not wanting to so overtly buddy up to the governor. Also around this time, he was made a colonel overseeing Boston's first corps of cadets, some of whom, by the way, would later allegedly take part in the Boston Tea Party. On the other side of the political conflict, Samuel Adams formed the Boston Committee of Correspondence, which, in turn, resulted in the formation of countless more similar local bodies throughout Massachusetts and beyond, in a loose network of groups dedicated to the opposition of various acts of parliament, with all of these beginning to coordinate their efforts. Not a good sign for the British government, who were about to make it all far worse for themselves in an effort to make the British East India Company happy. As had happened initially with the Stamp Act, Hancock was once again caught in between, given the House of Hancock so heavily depended on British trade. Thus at first he declined to join the Committee of Correspondence despite how prominent he'd been up to this point in opposing British parliamentary efforts. However, when matters began to heat up once again with the revelation that some of the governor's private letters had mentioned suspending various liberties of the colonists, as before, Hancock chose to side with the colonists, demanding the governor resign his position. This all now brings us to the so-called tea crisis, which the Boston Committee of Correspondence was charged with sorting. We'll spare you all the political and mercantile minutiae, but suffice it to say, thanks to rampant smuggling and extremely high taxes on tea in Britain, the British East India Company had a lot of excess tea and could not compete with the prices of smuggled Dutch tea in Britain or the colonies. Further, they were not legally allowed to sell their tea directly to the colonies, increasing prices even more there. That all changed with the Tea Act of 1773. This not only allowed them to sell their tea directly to the colonies, cutting out the middleman in Britain, but the totality of the change in law and reduction of taxes also allowed them to sell it at an even cheaper price than the smuggled Dutch tea in the colonies at the time. Seemed like a win for everyone, even the colonists, who would now be able to get their tea massively cheaper than before legally and slightly cheaper than they could before with smuggled tea. But you see, there were a number of problems with all of this from the colonist side. First, it was many of their own merchants who were smuggling the Dutch tea in, and their prices were now going to be undercut, essentially putting them out of the tea business. On top of that, the Tea Act that enacted all of this would in practice give the British a monopoly on tea in the region, with the fear being this would spread to other goods via similar parliamentary action. On top of that, there was of course the principle of the thing, that the colonists still were resentful of any such taxes levied against them, particularly with such taxes being used to pay for British officials and soldiers occupying the colonies that the colonists were not happy about being there. Of course, both Parliament and the British East India Company were well aware of the potential negative reaction to all of this, and it was even lobbied that they should just get rid of the part of the legislation that taxed the tea, as if it was kept, it was thought the colonists would outright reject the tea no matter how cheap they made it. Without that tax, this would still all be a major benefit to the British East India Company, as was one of the main points of the legislation. However, Prime Minister Lord North pushed back on this, insisting that the tax must be kept in order to help pay for the salaries of the various colonial officials. It was overall hoped, however, given the price would be much cheaper than before and the tax so low, the colonists would ultimately just accept it. When this was all decided, the British East India merchants were hopeful they could sweep the whole issue of the tax under the rug by just paying it directly in London or in some other clandestine fashion the colonists would not be aware of, with the tax then very much masked in the super cheap price of the tea. It was not to be, however, and when the colonists got word of the tax and incoming tea, they united against it via the aforementioned committees. There was a problem, however. 7 ships containing over 2,000 chests of tea were on their way bound for Boston, Charleston, Philadelphia, and New York. So how to respond to it? A boycott on the tea in this case was not deemed sufficient. A greater message needed sent back to Parliament, and so it was that protesters successfully coerced the tea consignees in Charleston, Philadelphia, and New York to resign their positions, with the tea in Charleston ultimately unclaimed and seized because of it, and the tea in New York and Philadelphia seeing the captains choosing to just return to England without unloading the cargo. Then we get to Massachusetts, the birthplace of the Revolution. There, Governor Hutchinson was determined to not have this happen and made sure the tea consignees refused to yield to the colonists' demands. It probably also helped that 2 of the consignees were the governor's sons. Thus, they did not resign and were prepared to do their jobs when the tea arrived. So, when the Dartmouth arrived with its load of tea on November the 28th, 1773, a meeting was set at Faneuil Hall on the 29th. Though because of how many thousands of people showed up, it had to be moved to the Old South Meeting House. There it was decided that a group of colonists would be in charge of making sure that the tea could not be unloaded and to monitor the ship in harbor 24/7. They also entreated the captain of the Dartmouth, James Hall, to simply return back to England, similar to what had happened in New York and Philadelphia. Noteworthy, the owner of the Dartmouth and the Beaver, which was soon to arrive with more tea, was Nantucket, Massachusetts native William Rush, who ultimately was also on board with the plan to simply send the tea back. The issue, however, was that Governor Hutchinson would not back down, refusing to let Captain Hall leave without first paying the import duty tax, whether he unloaded the cargo or not. There was also the fact that British Admiral John Montagu had ships just outside the harbor set to intervene if the Dartmouth tried to leave without paying the duty, or if the colonists forced her to leave. Thus, Captain Hall could not unload his tea thanks to the colonists, and he could not return to England without paying the tax. And if he did pay the tax, let's just say the colonists would not be pleased with their fellow colonist William Rush or him, a good old-fashioned standoff. You might at this point wonder why the governor didn't simply send to Castle William for troops to be dispatched to disband the colonists guarding the docks day and night. Well, the consignees did request this, but the request was denied. Presumably with the Boston Massacre fresh on their minds, they didn't wish to put their soldiers in close proximity to the now even more enraged colonists and try to force them to do something. And regardless, the governor felt he was going to win by default. You see, the law required if cargo was not unloaded and duties paid within 20 days, the customs officials could confiscate the cargo regardless of what the captain wanted to do. This would allow Admiral Montagu and soldiers from Castle William to bring ships over and simply take the cargo back to Castle William. From there, at their leisure, they could at any time clandestinely sell it to any merchants willing to buy it. This would see the tea successfully unloaded onto American soil no matter what the colonists wanted. In the interim of the deadline, 2 more tea ships, the Beaver and the Eleanor, arrived and were subsequently stuck in the same boat, metaphorically speaking. And so it was that with only 1 day to spare on the deadline where the tea could be confiscated, roughly 5,000 to 7,000 people, about 1 in 3 of all humans in Boston at the time, gathered at the Old South Meeting House with John Hancock moderating the debate. John Adams would later sum up the state of things at this point as discussed at the meeting. They could not send it back. The governor, admiral, and collector and controller would not suffer it. It was in their power to have saved it, but in no other. It could not get by the castle, the men of war, etc. Then there was no other alternative but to destroy it or let it be landed. To let it be landed would be giving up the principle of taxation by parliamentary authority, against which the continent have struggled for 10 years. It was losing all our labor for 10 years and subjecting ourselves and our posterity forever to Egyptian taskmasters, to burthens, ignites, to ignominy, reproach, and contempt, to dissolution and oppression, to poverty and servitude. The Boston Gazette on December the 20th would further report of the meeting's events, being informed by Mr. Rush, the owner of the Dartmouth and Beaver, that a clearance was refused him. They enjoined him immediately to enter a protest and apply to the governor for a passport by the castle, and adjourned again until 3 o'clock for the same day, at which time they again met, and after waiting till near sunset, Mr. Rush came in and informed them that he had accordingly entered his protest and waited on the governor for a pass, but His Excellency told him that he could not, consistent with his duty, grant it until his vessel was qualified. The people, finding all their efforts to preserve the property of the East India Company and returned it safely to London, frustrated by the tea consignees, the collectors of the customs, and the governor of the province, dissolved their meeting. Before the meeting broke up, however, with the continued refusal by the governor, Samuel Adams famously stated, "This meeting can do nothing further to save the country." Also famously during all of this, when the mood of the masses was seemingly dead set on destroying the tea, rather than use his popularity and influence to try to dissuade anyone of anything, John Hancock would state, "Let every man do what is right in his own eyes." And it was on. What followed was the then named destruction of the tea, though today is better known as the Boston Tea Party, in which a group of colonists, some of whom disguising themselves as Native Americans in symbolic rejection of their British birthrights, boarded the 3 ships. The aforementioned Boston Gazette news account would describe what happened next. A number of brave and resolute men determined to do all in their power to save their country from the ruin which their enemies had plotted, in less than 4 hours emptied every chest of tea on board the 3 ships commanded by the Captains Hall, Bruce, and Coffin, amounting to 342 chests, into the sea, without the least damage done to the ships or any other property. The masters and the owners are well pleased that their ships are thus cleared, and the people are almost universally congratulating each other on this happy event. As to how the individuals got into the holds without doing any damage to the ships, well, the captains had seemingly told their crews not to resist. For example, it was reported that the group that boarded the Beaver, to quote, sent a man to the mate who was on board in his cabin with a message, politely requesting the use of a few lights and the brig's keys so that as little damage as possible might be done to the vessel. And such was the case, this mate acted the part of a gentleman altogether. He handed over the keys without hesitation and without saying a single word, and sent his cabin boy for a bunch of candles to be immediately put in use. It was even reported that after the dumping, the rather polite rebels even took the time to sweep the decks clean, though they were cognizant of the fact that at any time Admiral Montague and his men could descend upon them, so worked as quickly as they could. As for Montague, he was not ignorant of what was happening and stated he watched the entire thing, even taunting some of those involved. As to why he did nothing, he would justify his actions, or lack thereof, the following day. "I could easily have prevented the execution of the plan, but must have endangered the lives of many innocent people by firing upon the town." In the aftermath, it would be none other than Paul Revere who is dispatched with the message of events by the Boston Committee of Correspondence to inform similar committees in New York. With his message more or less mirroring exactly what was reported in the Boston Gazette the next day, even parts word for word. Another interesting aside is that there was also a lesser-known destruction of the tea that occurred in Cape Cod shortly after the Boston Tea Party. Unlike in Boston, the tea in Cape Cod was successfully delivered and sold, only to see members of the Sons of Liberty track down where it was being stored, after which they destroyed it in March of 1774. Being rather thorough, after this, they found one merchant who'd already purchased some in Davison, Newman & Co., and, dressed as Native Americans again, broke into the tea shop, took the tea to the harbor, and unceremoniously dumped it in. While all of this might have seemed like an overreaction to what was, after all, much cheaper legal tea, Hancock would write in a letter dated December the 21st, 1773, "No one circumstance could possibly have taken place more effectively to unite the colonies than the maneuver of the tea. It is universally resented here, and people of all ranks detest the measure." John Adams would chime in his diary on December the 17th, 1773, "This is the most magnificent movement of all. There is a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in this last effort of the patriots that I greatly admire. The people should never rise without doing something to be remembered, something notable and striking. This destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible, and it must have so important consequences and so lasting that I can't but consider it as an epoch in history." Adams would also write to one Catherine Macaulay back in London in the aftermath, warning, "Let me tell those wise ministers, I would not advise them to try many more such experiments. A few more such experiments will throw most of the trade of the colonies into the hands of the Dutch, or will erect an independent empire in America, perhaps both. Nothing but equal liberty and kind treatment can secure the attachment of the colonies to Britain." It should also at this point be explicitly pointed out that because of the extreme stigma with regards to tea in the aftermath of all of this, tea drinking in America sharply dropped in popularity and coffee came to dominate. Going back to John Hancock, other than his aforementioned words at the final meeting to the crowd, he seemingly did not directly take part in the event as far as history is aware. However, given his extremely prominent position in the opposition, the British were convinced he was behind it, with one officer proclaiming, "It was King Hancock and the damned Sons of Liberty," with this nickname ultimately being adopted by the colonists, even used as a rallying cry of "King Hancock forever." One of those who did definitely take part in the Tea Party, Joseph Dyer, was also soon after arrested for boasting about his part in the affair. and on his way back to England after being arrested, he would claim both a British colonel and Admiral Montagu had tried to bribe him to claim that John Hancock had been behind the destruction of the tea, though British officials would later deny they ever made such an offer to Dyer, who was ultimately released and sent back to America in October of 1774. Whatever the case on that one, back in Britain, Parliament was in an uproar about the event, with Prime Minister Lord North declaring in the House of Commons on April the 22nd, 1774, "The Americans have tarred and feathered your subjects, plundered your merchants, burnt your ships, denied all obedience to your laws and authority. Yet so clement and so forbearing has our conduct been that it is incumbent on us now to take a different course. Whatever may be the consequences, we must risk something. If we do not, all is over." Attempting to smooth things over, New York merchant Robert Murray banded with others and offered to pay for the lost tea, but Lord North rejected their request, and instead, Parliament passed a sequence of what would ultimately be dubbed the Intolerable Acts as punishment, with 3 of them directed solely at Massachusetts. These were the Boston Port Act, which closed the port until both the colonists paid for the destroyed tea and officials were satisfied with the Boston Citizens' Order. Then there was the Massachusetts Government Act, removing the Massachusetts Charter and making the colony more directly subject to Britain via most colonial government positions, now to be appointed by the governor or parliament or king. This also mostly banned town meetings in all of Massachusetts without governor assent. Finally, the Administration of Justice Act, which made it so any royal officials accused of any crime would have their trial now take place in Britain, meaning any witnesses against such officials would have to travel to Britain to testify. Thus, most any official could now get away with an awful lot without fear of reprisal. On this one, the British government felt that the colonists were no longer capable of giving officials a fair trial, though the colonists fired back that they had done just this with the Boston Massacre, despite the extreme tensions at the time. Regardless of these acts only leveled at Massachusetts, other colonies didn't take kindly to Parliament asserting dominance over Massachusetts, ultimately continuing the trend of uniting the colonies together against what was more and more considered not their common homeland, but their common enemy. It didn't help that Britain also tacked on the Quartering Act to expand the power of British troops to find housing in the colonies. On this, if suitable housing was not provided for the soldiers by members of the colonies, the soldiers could simply occupy buildings as they pleased, though contrary to popular belief, it would seem they were technically only allowed to occupy unoccupied buildings in such cases, not currently occupied private homes as is usually claimed. Also in response to the Tea Party, General Thomas Gage was assigned to replace Hutchinson as governor. Noteworthy, General Gage was a man who once wrote, "America is a mere bully from one end to the other, and the Bostonians by far the greatest bullies." And that, to quote, "democracy is too prevalent in America." He thus felt things like town meetings and the like should be abolished to squash it and the rising threat it presented. I'm sure that's going to work out for him. Speaking of such town meetings, a few months after the Boston Tea Party, on the anniversary of the Boston Massacre on March the 5th, 1774, John Hancock would continue to assert himself as a leader of the budding rebellion, giving a public speech calling for the colonists to prepare to fight if necessary, stating, "Security to the persons and properties of the governed is so obviously the design and end of civil government that to attempt a logical proof of it would be like burning tapers at noonday to assist the sun in enlightening the world. And it cannot be either virtuous or honorable to attempt to support a government of which this is not the great and principal basis. Some boast of being friends to government. I am a friend to righteous government, to a government founded upon the principles of reason and justice. But I glory in publicly avowing my eternal enmity to tyranny. The troops of George III have crossed the wide Atlantic not to engage an enemy, but to assist a band of traitors in trampling on the rights and the liberties of his most loyal subjects in America. Let not the miscreant host vainly imagine that we fear their arms. No, them we despised. We dread nothing but slavery. Death is the creature of poltroon's brains. 'Tis a mortality to sacrifice ourselves for the salvation of our country. That gloomy night, the pale-faced moon and the affrighted stars that hurried through the sky can witness that we fear not death. I conjure you, by all that is dear, by all that is honorable, by all that is sacred, not only that you pray, but that you act, that if necessary, you fight and even die for the prosperity of our Jerusalem. Break in sunder with noble disdain the bonds with which the Philistines have bound you. Naturally, from such a speech that was borderline treasonous, a few months after his arrival, General Gage would remove Hancock as colonel of the Boston Cadets on August 1st, 1774, though the cadets did not take this lying down, meeting not long after and voting to disband in protest. After this, they gave their uniforms and equipment to Hancock for safekeeping until they could reform. Although disbanded, some of them would go on to join the Revolutionary forces. Beyond all this, General Gage would also cancel all meetings of the General Court. But once again, if you take away people's legal avenues to resist what they deem injustices, they will simply turn to illegal ways to do the exact same thing. Thus, the colonists decided if the General Court couldn't convene, they'd take the first full steps towards overt treason, establishing in October of 1774 the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, with this body completely independent from the British and with none other than John Hancock as their chosen president. Seeing the writing on the wall for what was coming, among other things, the Congress under Hancock established the first of the Minuteman companies that would soon be so critical to the rebellion. Fast forward to December of 1774, Hancock was elected to the Second Continental Congress, now serving both there and in the Massachusetts Provincial Congress as president. So it was that in April of 1775, Samuel Adams and John Hancock left Boston to attend the Provincial Congress in Concord. Deeming it unsafe to return to Boston afterwards, Adams and Hancock decided to instead stay at Hancock's brief childhood home in Lexington. And if those two towns of Lexington and Concord put so closely in conjunction to one another are cluing you in that something major was about to go down, you are correct. With these more overtly treasonous activities taking place, Secretary of the State William Legge, Earl of Dartmouth, instructed General Gage to, quote, to arrest the principal actors and abettors in the Provincial Congress whose proceedings appear in every light to be acts of treason and rebellion. Shortly after this, on the night of April the 18th, 1775, General Gage dispatched a large contingent of soldiers to Concord, instructing them to destroy caches of military supplies the colonists had been storing there. And while it's not totally clear today based on written orders that survive, it was rumored they were to go arrest John Hancock and Samuel Adams in Lexington as well. We'll have more on this in the next installment of this series, Hancock Revere's Ride. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. These are the words of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in his famous 1860 poem Paul Revere's Ride, which is where most of popular history's perception of this famous event and its purpose came from. But it turns out a huge percentage of the poem is wildly inaccurate, from Revere seeming to ride alone in the poem to the lanterns at the church being meant to tell Revere what message to send, rather than it being Revere himself who instructed how many lanterns to hang in case he should fail to get across the river and make his famous ride. Most significant of all in the inaccuracies, however, is where Revere was initially going and why. It turns out the primary concern before anything else was to warn John Hancock and Samuel Adams, who were lodging in Lexington at the time, that the British soldiers were seemingly coming for them. As we've previously covered in our videos Hancock, The Rise of the Merchant Prince, and Hancock, Igniting the Revolution, the oft-forgotten founding father John Hancock was a lot more prominent in the early going of the American Revolution than just his John Hancock on the Declaration of Independence, as is mostly all that's remembered of him today. But at this point in the story, the British had seemingly decided enough was enough, and it was time to do something about the so-called King Hancock and his partner in crime, Samuel Adams, a man who was the walking, talking epitome of the over 2,000-year-old general concept of the pen being mightier than the sword. On all of this, with tensions rising considerably in the aftermath of the Boston Tea Party and the British parliamentary's extremely harsh response in the Intolerable Acts, which both helped further unite the colonies against them, as well as force the people of Massachusetts to form their own independent governing body. At this point, Secretary of State William Legge, Earl of Dartmouth, instructed General Gage to arrest the principal actors and abettors in the Provincial Congress whose proceedings appear in every light to be acts of treason and rebellion. Unsurprisingly, after attending the Provincial Congress in Concord in April of 1775, John Hancock and Samuel Adams deemed it unsafe to return to Boston, instead deciding to stay at Hancock's brief childhood home near Concord in Lexington. after which they were to head off to Philadelphia to join the Continental Congress. Also in Concord at the time was a large cache of military supplies that the colonists had been accumulating in preparation for a potential armed conflict. Going back to Boston, at the time, members of the Sons of Liberty and others were closely monitoring the British troop activities day and night. Paul Revere would write in a letter in 1798 recounting, "In the winter towards the spring we frequently took turns 2 and 2 to watch the soldiers by patrolling the streets all night. The Saturday night preceding the 19th of April, about 12 o'clock at night, the boats belonging to the transports were all launched and carried under the sterns of the men of war. We likewise found that the grenadiers and light infantry were all taken off duty. From these movements, we expected something serious was to be transacted. On Tuesday evening, the 18th, it was observed that a number of soldiers were marching towards the bottom of the common. About 10 o'clock, Dr. Warren sent in great haste for me and begged that I would immediately set off for Lexington, where Messrs. Hancock and Adams were, and acquaint them of the movement, and that it was thought they were the objects." As for how Dr. Warren seemed to know where the troops were headed despite the secrecy being employed, this isn't clear today, as Gage claimed he told only his second in command and one other person, with that person generally thought to be his wife, Margaret Kemble Gage. Thing is, his wife was an American colonist herself, and it's speculated from this that she may have been the one to pass on what was afoot to Dr. Warren. Whatever the case, they're observing that something was happening and being apparently tipped off as to where the soldiers were going, Dr. Warren had decided that they must be going after Hancock and Adams, who were in the target region. Except after further discussion, given the number of soldiers seemingly being sent, it was decided that this could not be the only reason they were being dispatched, unless Gage was thinking the colonists would rise up and protect Hancock and Adams if they tried to take them. Thus, it was further hypothesized they must also be going after the military stores in Concord. As for the 41-year-old silversmith, Paul Revere being the one summoned, besides having run many other messages at times for the Sons of Liberty and other bodies in the cause, including back on December the 13th, 1774, even being sent all the way to Portsmouth, New Hampshire to warn the colonists there that they thought the redcoats were coming for their gunpowder stores, Revere had, according to his own account in a letter written to one Jeremy Belknap in 1798, just a few days before, been out to meet Hancock and Adams in Lexington, so knew exactly where to find them. Significant with this previous jaunt, it was thought at the time that at some point the British troops would be coming for the stores in Concord, so on Revere's return from this trip, he helped come up with the now famous lantern scheme. He writes, "I returned at night through Charleston. There I agreed with a Colonel Conant and some other gentlemen in Charleston that if the British went out by water, we would show 2 lanterns in the North Church steeple, and if by land, 1 as a signal. For we were apprehensive it would be difficult to cross the Charles River or get over the Boston Neck." Speaking of these 2 paths, Revere was to make the dangerous crossing of the Charles River, which required him to sneak past the HMS Somerset at anchor there, with crossing at that hour banned. As a backup, another man, one William Dawes, was to take the Boston Neck route in his own ride for the same purpose. And just in case both men failed, as noted, a further alert was given by Robert Newman at Boston's Old North Church using the lantern signal, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, that the British soldiers were coming via the Charles River. As for Revere, after being given this information from Dr. Warren, he first stopped by his house to get his riding boots and coat, and then met with some friends to row him across the river, slipping past the Somerset successfully. Once safely in Charleston, he informed local Sons of Liberty members there what was happening, then acquired a horse from a merchant by the name of John Larkin. He was also warned that some 10 British officers were previously seen departing along the road. Information in hand, he began his ride towards Lexington. Unfortunately, along the way, he did encounter the British patrols. Of his first encounter there, he writes, "After I passed Charleston Neck and got nearly opposite where Mark was hung in chains, I saw 2 men on horseback under a tree. When I got near them, I discovered they were British officers. One tried to get ahead of me and the other to take me. I turned my horse very quick and galloped towards Charleston Neck and then pushed for the Medford Road. The one who chased me, endeavoring to cut me off, got into a clay pond near where the new tavern is now built. I got clear of him and went up through Medford over the bridge and up to Menotomy." Along the way, he alerted dozens of others, some of whom, in turn, were dispatched to spread the word of the British troop movements. In the end, Revere successfully avoided capture and arrived at Hancock's home in Lexington around midnight. Upon approaching it, one Sergeant Monroe, who was guarding the house, requested Revere not make so much noise, to which Revere reportedly replied, "Noise? You'll have noise enough before long. The regulars are coming out." Of course, once the news of the troop movements and the apparent large number being sent was revealed, Hancock and Adams concurred that such a large force would not have been dispatched only to arrest them, and thus they must be targeting Concord and the militia stores there. And in fact, from surviving records, despite what the colonists thought here, it would appear General Gage had decided to ignore the order to arrest Hancock and Adams at this point, or at least there is no written record this was included in Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith's orders. Smith had simply been given charge of about 1,000 soldiers and was instructed to leave in the night in hopes of catching the colonists off guard and avoid any bloodshed in their mission, and that the whole thing was to be done, to quote, with utmost expedition and secrecy, and that they were to go to Concord, where you will seize and destroy all military stores, but you will take care that the soldiers do not plunder the inhabitants or hurt private property. However, given the secrecy and the many spies about, it's possible the order to arrest the men wasn't written in case it would get leaked and would thus alert them to run. And further, the soldiers were seemingly authorized to arrest any leaders of the opposition they encountered over the course of their duties, and so regardless, as the house Hancock and Adams were staying at was along the road along the way, it wasn't exactly a good place to be. On the flip side, if they had no intention of arresting Hancock and Adams yet, it's speculated Gage may have feared the colonists' reaction afterwards if he should do such a thing to two of their most popular leaders. Thus, rather than help quell the budding rebellion by getting rid of the two most prominent leaders, it might just cause it to go the other way and explode in his face. Whatever the case, after receiving the warning, Hancock and Adams dispatched Revere and Dawes, the latter of which had arrived about a half hour after Revere, to Concord to warn the militia there to move the military stores in case that was the intended target of the Redcoats as they thought. Revere and Dawes were also soon joined by fellow Sons of Liberty member Dr. Samuel Prescott along the way. As to why Prescott was out and about at that hour, he apparently was, to quote, returning from a lady friend's house at the awkward hour of 1 a.m. Thanks to this little alleged midnight hookup and subsequent, I guess we'll call it a ride of shame, the good doctor gets to be remembered by all of us today. Good for you, Dr. Prescott. As for why Prescott decided to journey with Revere and Dawes despite the extreme risk, he simply felt because he was well known in the region, people would, to quote Revere, give more credit to what we said. However, Revere reports, we had got nearly halfway, Mr. Dawes and the doctor stopped to alarm the people of a house. I was about 100 rod ahead when I saw two men in nearly the same situation as those officers were near Charleston. In an instant, I was surrounded by four. They had placed themselves in a straight road that inclined each way. They had taken down a pair of bars on the north side of the road, and two of them were under a tree in the pasture. The doctor being foremost, he came up and we tried to get past them, but they being armed with pistols and swords, they forced us into the pasture. The doctor jumped the horse over a low stone wall. And Dr. Prescott ultimately was successful in escaping this way and also managed to make it to Concord to warn those there. As for Revere, he states, I observed a wood at a small distance and made for that. When I got there, out started 6 officers on horseback and ordered me to dismount. One of them, who appeared to have the command, examined me, where I came from, and what my name was. I told him it was Revere. He asked if it was Paul. I told him yes. He asked me if I was an express. I answered in the affirmative. He demanded what time I left Boston. I told him and added that their troops had catched around in passing the river and that there would be 500 Americans there in short time, for I had alarmed the country all the way up. In an earlier deposition to the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, Revere also noted in this part that the soldier equipped back to Revere's mark that 500 militia would be there, that they had 1,500 coming. Revere then states when Major Mitchell hit him over the head with his pistol and threatened to blow his brains out if he didn't tell the truth, to which Revere replied, I esteemed myself a man of truth, that he had stopped me on the highway and made me a prisoner, I knew not by what right. I would tell him the truth, I was not afraid. He then asked me the same questions that the other did, and many more, but was more particular. I gave him much the same answers. Revere was then joined with other prisoners caught that night, spreading the word, and they all headed off to Lexington. Along the way, Revere states, they very often insulted me, calling me rebel, etc., etc. After we had got about a mile, I was given to the sergeant to lead. He was ordered to take out his pistol, and if I run, to execute the major's sentence. When we got within about a half a mile of the meeting house, we heard a gun fired. The major asked me what it was for. I told him to alarm the country. Soon after the gunfire, bells began to ring, with one of the other captives then reportedly yelling at the soldiers holding them, "The bell's ringing, the town's alarmed, and you are all dead men." At this point, rather than continue on, the soldiers felt they should instead, with all haste, go and warn their commanders, and perhaps were not exactly enthusiastic about continuing without an army at their backs. Either way, they let their captives go, though took Revere's horse before rushing off. Revere then simply went back to the house where Adams and Hancock were, and then helped them pack up and depart. After traveling with the company to Woburn, where Hancock and Adams would ultimately stay, he then returned to Lexington to see what was transpiring. During his activities there, he reports hearing the first shots of the war, stating, "When we had got about 100 yards from the meeting house, the British troops appeared on both sides of the meeting house. In their front was an officer on horseback. They made a short halt, when I saw and heard a gun fire, which appeared to be a pistol. Then I could distinguish 2 guns and then a continual roar of musketry." In the aforementioned deposition to the Massachusetts Provincial Congress in 1775, a couple decades before the preceding account, Revere tells more or less the exact same story, but would also state, for whatever it's worth, it was the British soldiers who fired first, as he claims when he was passing through the militia ranks directly before the shots were fired, "I heard the commanding officer speak to his men to this purpose: let the troops pass by and don't molest them without they begin first. I had to go across the road. When the troops appeared in sight behind the meeting house, they made a short halt. When one gun was fired, I heard the report, turned my head, and saw the smoke in front of the troops. They immediately gave a great shout, ran a few paces, and then the whole fired." In the end, the entire ride was extremely effective, with the alarm and muster system the colonists had developed for just such an occasion working like a charm via the riders, bells, drums, bonfires, and alarm guns being fired, making it so that the militias upwards of 25 miles away were already aware a large force was on its way while the British regulars were still being unloaded in Cambridge. Because of all of this, the colonists were able to remove most of the supplies before the British arrived, and while the Redcoats did successfully destroy the remainder, from the first shots on, they met with resistance both during these activities and their entire march back to Boston, with Minutemen hiding along the road and firing among them. This all resulted in 273 British soldier casualties to 93 American. Going back to Hancock and Adams' flight, Hancock's initial response was allegedly to grab a musket and attempt to join the Patriot militia, but Samuel Adams supposedly convinced him his duty to the cause was not to fight besides the men with a gun, but to join the Continental Congress in Philadelphia and fight in that way there. Noteworthy, while Hancock and Adams were to flee, he left his fiancée Dolly and his Aunt Lydia behind in Lexington, though instructed Dolly that she was not to return to Boston as it was too dangerous a place to be. To which Dolly reportedly retorted, "Recollect, Mr. Hancock, that I am not under your control yet. I shall go to my father tomorrow." As noted, Adams and Hancock then set off about 5 miles away to Woburn, where they spent a few days before departing to Philadelphia. Along the way to Philadelphia, they were reportedly cheered at several points, with Hancock's reputation given recent events through the roof in the colonies. Hancock and Adams would only get even more popular among the Patriots, given that in the aftermath of the initial shots of the war, General Gage issued a statement to the masses writing, "I do hereby, in His Majesty's name, offer and promise His most gracious pardon to all persons who shall forthwith lay down their arms and return to the duties of peaceable subjects, excepting only Samuel Adams and John Hancock, whose offenses are too flagitious a nature to admit of any other consideration than that of condign punishment." Naturally, among the Patriot masses, offenses too flagitious a nature of any other consideration was a very good thing. Of the journey to Philadelphia and arrival, Hancock would write his fiancée on May 7, 1775, "My dear Dolly, I arrived well after having rode so fast and so many miles you may well think I was much fatigued, but no sooner had I got into the room of the house, we were visited by a great number of gentlemen of the first character in the city who took up the evening. We were to have a large guard in several boats, and a number of the city gentlemen will attend us over. I can't think they will dare attack us. My poor face and eyes are in a most shocking situation, burnt up and much swelled and a little painful. I don't know how to manage with it. Pray let me hear from you every post. God bless you, my dear girl, and believe me most sincerely, yours most affectionately, John Hancock." In the aftermath of this arrival, the then President of Congress, Peyton Randolph, resigned, and John Adams nominated John Hancock to become the new President of Congress, with approval quickly unanimously followed on May 24, 1775. This was a role Hancock was remarkably well suited for, given his vast experience with business, finance, and negotiations. On this note, Hancock was dealing with 2 primary groups internally. one who wanted to work towards delay measures against the British and to reach a suitable reconciliation where the colonists could rejoin the British Empire with their freedoms and rights restored. And on the other side, the hardcore revolutionaries like Samuel and John Adams, who were, perhaps not quite so publicly yet, still more and more of the mindset that independence from Britain was inevitable. Functioning as a mediator between the two groups, Benjamin Harrison would observe of Hancock, "Our president is noble and generous to a very great degree." Of course, they were rebelling and had countless militia groups now openly opposing the British regulars that needed a commander to unify efforts. This was allegedly the real role in the conflict that Hancock wanted, though it should be noted that despite widespread claims of this, the only hard documented evidence of it was in something John Adams wrote in 1801, alluding to Hancock being disappointed he wasn't chosen to lead the army, with Adams writing, "But when I came to describe Washington for the commander, I never remarked a more sudden and striking change of countenance. Mortification and resentment were expressed as forcibly as his face could exhibit them." Mr. Samuel Adams seconded the motion, and that did not soften the president's physiognomy at all. As to why John Adams went with nominating Virginian George Washington on June the 15th, 1775, it was generally felt that if they didn't appoint a Virginian, the southern colonies may not support the cause, and the 43-year-old Washington was deemed the most qualified from Virginia, who was still young enough to likely be able to survive the conflict if it went on for many years. As for his experience, Washington had previously served as a major in the Virginia militia during the French and Indian War, among other military exploits. His selection was also helped by the fact that Washington's general demeanor and look reportedly inspired confidence in those around him. As fellow founding father Benjamin Rush would write, "He has so much martial dignity in his deportment that you distinguish him to be a general and a soldier from among 10,000 people." However, Washington's response to the appointment was not exactly enthusiastic, stating, "I am truly sensible of the high honor done me in this appointment, yet I feel great distress from a consciousness that my abilities and military experience may not be equal to the extensive and important trust." While some might think this was just Washington being publicly humble, as was expected at the time when nominated for prominent positions like this, Washington mirrored the sentiment in private letters in a seemingly very genuine way, often lamenting he did not feel qualified for what they were asking him to do. Most strikingly, Patrick Henry would claim that after Washington was voted into the position, he was discussing it with Washington when the newly appointed general's eyes filled with tears and he lamented, "Remember, Mr. Henry, what I now tell you. From the day I enter upon the command of the American armies, I date my fall and the ruin of my reputation." Nevertheless, he accepted the role with one of his own rules to live by being, to quote him, "When my country demands sacrifice, personal ease must always be a secondary consideration." Naturally feeling unqualified, however, one of his first acts was to purchase every book he could find on leading and managing armies. Going back to Hancock and his alleged desire for Washington's role, it's sometimes claimed that Hancock harbored extreme dislike for Washington in the aftermath of this, but all evidence is to the contrary, and Hancock even named his only son John George Washington Hancock. So yeah. On top of that, when Washington would later march into Boston, Washington wrote to Hancock telling him of the state of Hancock's estate there, and that, "I have a particular pleasure in being able to inform you, sire, that your house had received no damage worth mentioning. Your furniture is in tolerable order, and the family pictures are all left entire and untouched." In reply, Hancock invited Washington to live in his house for as long as he wished while there, and that, "I assure you, sire, I will do all in my power to render your stay agreeable, and my house shall be entirely at your disposal." That said, Hancock did appear to want some sort of military position, as he requested to serve under Washington, writing to him on July the 10th, 1775, "I must beg the favor that you will research some berth for me in such department as you may judge most proper, for I am determined to act under you, if it be to take a firelock and join the ranks as a volunteer." His request was politely declined, however, with Hancock's prodigious business and management skills far more suited for his current role in Congress than as a soldier. In any event, speaking of Hancock's son, during a recess of Congress in August of 1775, Hancock made good use of the break and married Dorothy Dolly Quincy on the 28th of that month in Connecticut. As a brief aside, not long before this, none other than Aaron Burr would reportedly come calling on Dolly, with Burr being a nephew of Dolly and Hancock's aunt's host at the time. And apparently Burr did turn Dolly's head a bit, but the family plans for Hancock and Dolly to wed remained intact. This may, however, have been why Dolly hadn't been writing to Hancock much, and only short letters when she did, with Hancock lamenting on June the 10th, 1775, "My dear Dolly, I am almost prevailed on to think that my letters to my aunt and you are not read, for I cannot obtain a reply. I have asked 1,000,000 questions and not an answer to one. I begged you to let me know what things my aunt wanted and you, and many other matters I wanted to know, but not one word in answer. I beg, my dear Dolly, you will write me often and long letters. I will forgive the past if you will mend in the future. Pray write me. I will attend to all your commands. Adieu, my dear girl, and believe me to be with great esteem and affection, yours without reserve, John Hancock." Man, when even the literal president of Congress and one of the wealthiest, most popular, and charismatic man in all of America gets ghosted by his own fiancé. Ouch. In any event, they would indeed get married anyway, despite the ghosting, and would the following year have a daughter who ultimately died as a baby because the bass was the worst, and you could pretty much just always expect half your kids to die before adulthood up until shockingly recently in history. On that note, they later had their aforementioned son, born 2 years later, John George Washington Hancock, who would also die, this time at 10 years old, when he fell while ice skating and hit his head. Going back to his presidency, from here Hancock was in his element, and this was seemingly partially why he was chosen for the role, with his primary tasks including mediating, coordinating committees, negotiation, drumming up and distributing funds to finance all the military efforts, convincing colonial officials to send more troops and supplies to join Washington, and otherwise just administering everything, which was a skill he was extremely proficient at from his years of running the House of Hancock. Speaking of the business side of it all, to give a taste of the difficulties at the time, Massachusetts, for example, was about 11 million pounds in debt, while its citizens were also already being taxed among the highest of any of the colonies. Yet Hancock and Congress somehow needed to raise many millions more, with Washington writing to him at one point in the early going he needed at least £250,000 per month to sustain his fledgling army, along with an awful lot of equipment and the like that were in short supply. Again, while for much of the philosophical and political intrigue side of things, others like John Adams, James Madison, and Ben Franklin and their incredible intellects and knowledge of political science were needed. And for the military side, Washington was the best man for the job they had available. For this side of it though, the merchant king John Hancock could not have been better suited for the role he was given, coordinating and mediating everything, as well as figuring out how to pay for it all and source the equipment and other resources they needed. In a nutshell, they needed a great businessman and financier, and so they used the one they had. Naturally, to help out in all of this, Hancock further brought on board one of his top managers at the House of Hancock, William Palfrey. As a taste of one small effort that resulted in big things here, it would later be noted in Lives of American Merchants, published in October of 1793, "To Hancock, among others, we owe our independence, our liberty, our prosperity, and our national greatness, and the high rank we hold among the nations of the earth. We are indebted to him for the aid which in our revolutionary struggle was derived from the arms and influence of France. For it was his generosity that furnished the means, when our country was utterly destitute of money or credit, to fit out the Alliance frigate to carry Colonel Lawrence, our first accredited diplomatic agent, to the court of the French king, through whose influence and exertions during our darkest period of our revolutionary history, the cooperation of France was secure and her assistance extended to help us break the chains of the political slavery with which we were bound." Of course, the British weren't going to take any of this sitting down, but General Gage did not have enough manpower to put down the rebellion. He wrote of the state of things to the Secretary of War, "These people show a spirit and conduct against us they never showed against the French. They are now spirited up by a rage and enthusiasm as great as ever people were possessed of, and you must proceed in earnest or give the business up. A small body acting in one spot will not avail. You must have large armies making diversions on different sides to divide their forces. The loss we have sustained is greater than we can bear. Small armies cannot afford such losses, especially when the advantage gained tends to do little more than gaining of a post." And so it was that the British dispatched a massive army led by Admiral Richard Howe and General William Howe to subdue the rebels with any force they deemed necessary. Hancock would write to the various state legislatures after the arrival of the enemy forces, "Our affairs are hastening fast to a crisis, and the approaching campaign will, in all probability, determine forever the fate of America. The militia of the United Colonies are called upon to say whether they will live slaves or die free men. On your exertions, the salvation of America now depends." We'll continue this tale in the next video in the series, Hancock, We Hold These Truths to Be Self-Evident. In 1775, the members of the Second Continental Congress and their president, John Hancock, were in a bit of a conundrum. On the one hand, act after act of the British Parliament were making it clear Parliament not only considered themselves the de facto rulers and governing body of the colonies, but that any pushback against Parliament would result in harsh penalties. On the other hand, the general sentiment among the populace and leaders of the colonies was to continue to push for peace and remain in the British Empire. In a nutshell, being part of the British Empire was not generally considered the problem, simply that Parliament continued to act like it ruled in America instead of the local colonial governments. Thus, the colonists wanted Parliament to leave them be while remaining loyal subjects to the king. In fact, almost exactly a year before Congress would declare independence, they tried very hard to go the other way in their olive branch petition to King George III, approved on July 5, 1775. In it, Congress stated, "We, your majesty's faithful subjects of the colonies, entreat your majesty's gracious attention to this our humble petition. We not only most ardently desire the former harmony between her and these colonies may be restored, but that a concord may be established between them upon so firm a basis as to perpetuate its blessings uninterrupted by any future dissensions, to succeeding generations in both countries. That your majesty may enjoy a long and prosperous reign, and that your descendants may govern your dominions with honor to themselves and happiness to their subjects, is our sincere and fervent prayer." Thus, professing their loyalty to the king and desire to remain in the British Empire, they simply were asking that he intercede on their behalf with Parliament and their recent actions against the American colonies. Had King George responded differently here, much of history would have irrevocably changed. But instead, he allegedly did not even bother to read their petition before issuing the Proclamation of Rebellion on August 23, 1775, writing, "Whereas many of our subjects in diverse parts of our colonies and plantations in North America, misled by dangerous and ill-designing men, and forgetting the allegiance which they owe to the power that has protected and supported them, have at length proceeded to open an avowed rebellion by arraying themselves in a hostile manner, we have thought fit to issue our royal proclamation hereby declaring that not only all our officers, civil and military, are obliged to exert their utmost endeavors to suppress such rebellion and to bring the traitors to justice, but that all our subjects of this realm and the dominions thereunto belonging are bound by law to be aiding and assisting in the suppression of such rebellion, in order to bring to condign punishment the authors, perpetrators, and abettors of such traitorous designs." Doubling down on disabusing the colonists of the notion that he would be loyal to them, his subjects, and not Parliament, King George also went ahead and began hiring mercenaries to level against the colonists. Further antagonizing the traitors to the British crown, Parliament soon after passed the Prohibitory Act of 1775, which not only removed the colonies from protection of the king, but also put an end to any trade with the colonies in an attempt to wreck their economy. On top of this, it also declared that any ship found trading with the colonists, to quote, "shall be forfeited to his majesty, as if the same were the ships and effects of open enemies." As for the Continental Congress's thoughts on all this, they noted that as to the king, we had been bound to him by allegiance, but that this bond was now dissolved by his assent to the late Act of Parliament, by which he declares us out of his protection. John Adams would also chime in, "It throws 13 colonies out of the royal protection, levels all distinctions, and makes us independent in spite of our supplications and entreaties. It may be fortunate that the act of independency should come from the British Parliament rather than the American Congress." As with the Boston Tea Party in our previous video in this series, Hancock Igniting the Revolution, where the colonists were forced between submitting and allowing the tea to touch American soil, or destroy it, the colonists were now forced via British government action to choose between two paths. On the one hand, they could submit and accept parliamentary rule over themselves without representation in that body, as well as any penance Parliament required for their act of rebellion. Or they could officially cut ties with their motherland and fight one of the most powerful empires in history for independence. There no longer seemed any option of a middle ground. As Thomas Jefferson would sum up the state of things at this point to one of his friends, now returned to England, loyalist John Randolph, in a letter written on November the 29th, 1775, in an earlier part of this contest, our petitions told the king that from our king there was but one appeal, The admonition was despised, and that appeal forced on us. To undo his empire, he has but one more truth to learn, that after colonies have drawn the sword, there is but one step more they can take. That step is now pressed upon us by the measures adopted. Believe me, dear sir, there is not in the British Empire a man who more cordially loves a union with Great Britain than I do. But by the God that made me, I will cease to exist before I yield to a connection on such terms as the British Parliament propose. And in this, I think I speak the sentiments of America. We want neither inducement nor power to declare and assert a separation. It is will alone which is wanting, and that is growing apace under the fostering hand of our king. One bloody campaign will probably decide everlasting our future course. If our winds and waters should not combine to rescue their shores from slavery, and General Howe's reinforcements should arrive in safety, we have hopes he will be inspired to come out of Boston and take another drubbing, and we must drub him soundly before the scepter tyrant will know we are not brutes to crouch under his hands and kiss the rod which he deigns to scourge us. With no other way forward but subservience, over the following months, one by one the colonies began to fall in line with the notion of breaking away from the British Empire, with North Carolina on April 12, 1776 being the first to officially empower their delegates to vote for independence, followed by Rhode Island becoming the first to openly declare independence on May 4th. Nevertheless, as summer approached, debate over the matter was reportedly extremely heated, with on May 15th, Maryland's delegation even walking out of the proceedings on passing a preamble as a precursor to an official declaration of independence. Nevertheless, 9 out of the 13 colonies voted for the preamble, and it was passed. That very day, the Virginian legislature also instructed their delegation to propose to that respectable body to declare the United Colonies free and independent states. And so it was that on June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia officially proposed just such a resolution, ultimately seconded by John Adams. Resolved that these United Colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. The pushback was still there, however. Once again, at this point, most agreed that independence was inevitable given British actions, but there was still heated debate over the timing, with some arguing they should wait until they had secured foreign aid, without which it seemed probable the revolution would fail. Another issue at this point was that some of the colonies had still not yet authorized their delegates to vote on the matter of independence. Thus, a vote was withheld on it, but in the interim, it was decided to have a document drawn up which would both declare the colonies' independence and list the reasons why they felt justified in taking this extreme action, with the so-called Committee of Five put together to draft the document, comprising of John Adams, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. In a surprising move, the committee selected the young 33-year-old Jefferson to write the document over the much more distinguished writer and well-known individual worldwide in Ben Franklin, or one of the pinnacles of legal and political minds in the world at the time in John Adams. It was, however, Adams who would persuade both the committee to choose Jefferson and to convince Jefferson himself to take the lead. Adams would write to Jefferson on his reasoning. Reason first, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can. Unfortunately, the committee did not keep minutes on their internal discussions, so there isn't a whole lot to say about its drafting, but as to the text of the Declaration, Jefferson would state it was neither aiming at originality of principle or sentiment, nor yet copied from any particular and previous writing. It was intended to be an expression of the American mind, and to give to that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. In the end, it ultimately borrowed from everything from John Locke to the 1689 English Declaration of Rights, which had ended the reign of King James II. Now nearing the end of June, the legislatures of all but 2 of the colonies, Maryland and New York, had finally authorized their delegates to vote on the matter of independence, and the Provincial Congress of New Jersey even had their royal governor, William Franklin, arrested on June the 15th. However, one of Maryland's delegates, Samuel Chase, was ultimately able to convince the Assembly of the Counties of Maryland to change their mind on June the 28th and allow the Maryland delegates to vote on the matter. This was the same day the Committee of Five first presented their final draft of a declaration by the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled to Congress. New York delegates, however, had to abstain from voting on it owing to British forces interfering with the provincial Congress there convening to give them permission. Nevertheless, over the next few days, Congress continually made tweaks to the Committee of Five's document, cutting out about a quarter of the original text, as well as tweaking the wording here and there. As to what was removed, most notably was a section where Jefferson, ironically not only a slaveholder himself, but who would eventually have an entire family and long-term relationship with one of his slaves, not only condemned the evil of slavery, but accused King George of aiding that institution in the colonies. Jefferson would later write of why this text was removed. The clause 2, reprobating the enslaving the inhabitants of Africa, was struck out in complaisance to South Carolina and Georgia, who had never attempted to restrain the importation of slaves and who, on the contrary, still wished to continue it. Our northern brethren also, I believe, felt a little tender under these censures, for though their people had very few slaves themselves, yet they had been pretty considerable carriers of them to others. With the document finalized on July the 1st and a vote pending, John Dickinson, who opposed any violent means to resolve their issues with Britain, tried one last-ditch effort to forego any such declaration until they were much more secure in their position with foreign aid and had completed the Articles of Confederation. But he was opposed, as ever, by John Adams, who gave an impassioned speech the other way in response. As a brief aside, Dickinson would, in the aftermath, both refuse to vote on the matter, as well as later refuse to sign the Declaration, and because of this, was not able to remain a member of the Continental Congress, though did voluntarily resign rather than be forcibly removed. Dickinson would state of all this, "My conduct this day I expect will give the finishing blow to my once too great and, my integrity considered, now too diminished popularity." Despite his opposition, which again included extreme opposition to violent means to achieve independence, rather than abstain from fighting upon leaving Congress, Dickinson immediately joined the Pennsylvania militia, one of the only members of the Continental Congress to directly take up arms during the war. Further, as much as Adams and he had been adversaries in Congress over the matter of independence, because of Dickinson's standing by his principles so vehemently, even giving all it cost him to do so, Adams would remark of him, "Mr. Dickinson's alacrity and spirit certainly becomes his character and sets a fine example." In the end, on July the 2nd, 12 of the 13 colonies voted in favor of independence, with only the New York delegates abstaining until they could get permission to vote on the matter, which happened about a week later. Document finally approved, as President of Congress, John Hancock seems to have signed it, with Secretary of Congress Charles Thompson also signing it as witness. Hancock then ordered to have printer John Dunlap make around 200 copies to be distributed to the masses and the world, today known as the Dunlap broadsides. And yes, on this note, seemingly just John Hancock signed it at this point, though even that isn't technically known for sure, as the original copy sent to Dunlap was lost, though given Hancock and then Thompson's name as witness were printed on these, it's generally assumed Hancock did sign it. As for the version of the Declaration of Independence most people know today with Hancock's famed giant signature, this engrossed version that is on display at the United States National Archives wasn't created until sometime after July 19th, and ultimately wasn't signed by everyone until August 2nd. As for this signing, Benjamin Rush stated that it was a fairly somber affair, with only the portly Benjamin Harrison trying to break the mood by cracking a joke to Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, stating, "I shall have great advantage over you, Mr. Gerry, when we are all hung for what we are now doing. From the size and weight of my body, I shall die in a few minutes and be with the angels, but from the lightness of your body, you will dance in the air an hour or two before you are dead." Russ states Gerry's only reply was to, quote, "a transient smile, but it was soon succeeded by the solemnity with which the whole business was conducted." This all brings us to John Hancock's signature on the engrossed copy of the Declaration, and why it was so much bigger than everyone else's, leading to his name being synonymous with one's signature. As for the common myth, legend has it that Hancock signed the document front and center and so big so that King George could see his name without needing to put on his glasses. But there's no evidence of any of this, and as noted, the previous printed versions that King George would actually see simply had Hancock's name printed on. Further, if you've watched the other videos in this series, Hancock Rise of the Merchant Prince, Hancock Igniting the Revolution, and Hancock Revere's Ride, you'll know King George was already extremely well aware of John Hancock's significant role in the rebellion, so a giant signature was not needed to make it clear who was president of the Continental Congress. In fact, it was John Hancock's signature that was first and foremost on the previous olive branch petition to the king that had been so soundly rejected. So why was Hancock's signature bigger than everyone else's and front and center? Well, nobody can say for sure. Most likely it was simply because of the very aforementioned fact that he was the president of Congress and first to sign it. So chose to sign right in the center, and without yet any other signatures there, he had no real gauge of how big or small to make it. And contrary to what you might think from what people say, if you've never seen it, if you take out everyone else's signature, nothing about his signature looks out of place in size or position on the document. It's really not that big except relative to the other signatures. As to why everyone else chose to make theirs smaller, this may have been in slight deference to Hancock as their president, or may have simply been that the first to sign after him chose to make it smaller for whatever reason, so everyone else just followed suit. As for those signature sizes, after Hancock, William Ellery was the next biggest at about 60% the space taken up by Hancock's signature, with Carter Braxton the smallest at about 1/10 the space, and everyone else's randomly in between. But to sum up that, again, being the first to sign, Hancock did not have any gauge to know how big anyone else would sign, so seemingly just did what seemed appropriate without such a reference. Although I think the best explanation we've ever heard was written by one Matt Stofsky. His entire explanation is too long to fully illustrate here, but in part, he gives a totally, and in all ways we are sure, accurate account of John Hancock's reasoning, with Hancock definitely writing the following as relayed by Stofsky. Now that our noble document is complete, it is time to address the elephant in the room. My name is much bigger than everyone else's. I'll be the first to admit that it is absolutely massive, yet I must also speak this self-evident truth. It is not entirely my fault. The fact is, I thought we were all doing big signatures. That's what I was told. Do none of you remember Thomas Jefferson hopped up on parchment fumes and cheap barley wine, running around telling everyone our Sigs had to be frickin' huge? Then I go first, and everybody bursts out laughing like I did something foolish. I hereby call on my brethren of the Second Continental Congress, those who I know to be defenders of liberty, progress, and the values of the Enlightenment, to which we are all fanboyishly devoted for some reason, to publicly stand up and say, everybody told John Hancock we were doing big Sigs. Whatever the case there, in the aftermath of the Dunlop broadsides being printed and distributed, there was no going back. It was a successful revolution, or every member of the committee would be executed for treason. John Hancock would write of this in a letter to George Washington on July 6, 1776, stating, "Although it is not possible to foresee the consequences of human actions, yet it is nevertheless a duty we owe ourselves and posterity in all our public councils to decide in the best manner we are able, and to leave the event to that being who controls both causes and events to bring about his own determinations." Of course, being commander of the revolutionary forces, Washington was no doubt praying hard right then to that being that controls both causes and events, because mere days after the Declaration of Independence was announced to the world on July 4th, 1776, the aforementioned British troops under command of the Howe brothers sailed into Staten Island. Both Admiral Richard Howe and General William Howe had previously strongly sympathized with the colonists, with William Howe even before the war at various points arguing for fairer treatment of the American colonies in Parliament. The pair also delayed their departure to the colonies a considerable amount of time to try to acquire powers to negotiate a peace rather than simply subjugating the colonists with force. However, while they may have sympathized with their former compatriots, their goal upon arriving in the New World was to put an end to the rebellion by any means necessary. Towards this end, they brought with them an army of around 32,000 soldiers and seamen, along with a whopping 400 ships, including nearly 100 warships. On the other side, the relatively newly minted General George Washington had been preparing defenses of the region, correctly guessing that it was in New York that the British would strike with these invading forces. In order to try to get Washington more support, as Howe was gathering his forces, Hancock would write the state assemblies stating, "I must repeat again to you that the fate of America will be determined by the ensuing campaign. I cannot help, therefore, once more pressing you to be expeditious in equipping and sending forward your troops. May the great disposer of all human events animate and guide your counsels, and enable you so to determine that you may not only establish your own temporal peace and happiness, but those of your posterity. Forgive this passionate language. I am unable to restrain it. It is the language of the heart." In a similar letter, he would write, calling for aid, "Our affairs are hastening fast to a crisis, and the approaching campaign will, in all probability, determine forever the fate of America. The militia of the United Colonies are called upon to say whether they will live slaves or die free men. On your exertions, the salvation of America now depends." As for Howe, he initially attempted a peaceful resolution on July the 20th. However, upon learning from Colonel James Patterson at a meeting discussing terms that Howe had only been granted the power to offer pardons in negotiations for peace, Washington famously replied, "Those who have committed no fault want no pardon." Diplomacy having failed, the Howe brothers decided to attack, and a few weeks later, the then largest known battle ever fought in North America, involving close to 40,000 troops, including naval forces, was game on. What followed was a sweeping British victory which was almost catastrophic for the traitors to the British crown, potentially ending the rebellion right there. You see, during the fighting, Howe managed to corner nearly half of Washington's entire army, but for reasons still not totally clear today, Howe decided to cease pressing the attack at that point and instead ordered his soldiers to dig into their position. Speculations as to why he stopped are anything from that he thought Washington was surrounded and was giving him a chance to surrender rather than be slaughtered, to that he simply thought pressing the attack, while likely to succeed, would have cost too many lives he could not easily replace. And as he felt his enemy couldn't escape, there was little lost in taking the time to fortify his position. Whatever Howe was thinking here, Washington did not have surrender on his mind. Instead, in part aided by seemingly history-changing fog that no doubt had Washington thanking the being that controls both causes and events, Washington was able to slip the some 9,000 soldiers he had in that position away into Manhattan, all without the British realizing their enemy was escaping. Thus, what could have been a blow to the Continental Army that may well have ended any real chance at independence while the ink on the Declaration of Independence was barely dry, instead saw the demoralized Continental Army having suffered a major defeat with over 1,000 captured soldiers and a significant position lost, but they, at least, mostly survived to fight another day. Things in the aftermath, however, would not improve much, with the revolutionary forces being defeated again and again and again, such as at Kips Bay, Harlem Heights, White Plains, and Fort Washington. With retreat after retreat and the budding nation desperately in need of funds to support war efforts, by 1777 things were bleak. Though despite all of this, John Adams would steadfastly write, "Affairs are delicate and critical. The panic may seize whom it will not seize me." John Hancock would write to his wife Dolly on March the 10th about the state of affairs at this point, illustrating the more personal side of the struggle for all those involved, generally kept from their families and homes and in a perpetual heightened state of extreme stress. "My dear, dear Dolly, my detention at the ferry and the badness of the roads prevented my arriving here until Friday evening. I put my things into Mr. Williams' house and went in pursuit of lodgings. Neither Mrs. Yard nor Lucy could accommodate me. I then went to Smith's and borrowed 2 blankets and returned to my own house. I lead a doleful, lonesome life. Though on Saturday I dine with Dr. Shippens. He is as lonesome as I. I long to have you here, and I know you will be as expeditious as you can. When I part from you again, it must be at very extraordinary occasion. However unsettled things may be, I could not help sending for you, as I cannot live in this way. We have an abundance of lies. The current report is that General Howe is bent on coming here. We must, however, take our chances. I hope you will be able to pack up all your things quickly and have them on the way, and that you will soon follow. Young Mr. Hillegas got here on Saturday. He is well. He delivered me your letter. I was exceedingly glad to hear from you and hope soon to receive another letter. I know you will set off as soon as you can. Endeavor to make good stages. I must leave those matters to you, as the road must, in great measure, determine your stages. I do not imagine there is any danger of smallpox on the road. Wilmington is the most dangerous, but go on to Chester. I want to get somebody clever to accompany you. I hope to send one to you, but if I should not be able to, you must make out as well as you can." Speaking of Howe advancing on them, Alexander Hamilton would write to John Hancock on September the 18th, 1777, "If Congress have not yet left Philadelphia, they ought to do it immediately without fail, for the enemy have the means of throwing a party this night in the city. I just now crossed the Valley Ford, in doing which a party of the enemy came down and fired upon us in the boat, by which means I lost my horse. 1 man was killed and another wounded. The boats were abandoned and will fall into their hands." Going back to the personal side of things, on October the 18th, 1777, Hancock would write Dolly again, stating, "My dear Dolly, I am now at this date and not a line from you, nor a single word have I heard from you since your arrival at Worcester, which you may judge affects me not a little, but I must submit and will only say that I expected often to have been the object of your attention. This is my 6th letter to you. I long to see you. I shall close all my business in 3 days, and indeed have already nearly finished, and when once I set out shall travel with great great speed. Nothing will prevent me from seeing you soon, with the leave of Providence. I need not tell you there will be no occasion of your writing me after the receipt of this. My best wishes attend you for every good. I have much to say, which I leave to a cheerful evening with you in person. Noteworthy on this apparent ghosting by his wife, the couple's baby Lydia had died just a few months before, and it may well be she was a little emotionally preoccupied. Or perhaps, as noted in our previous video, Hancock Revere's Ride, where she ghosted him yet again for a time shortly before their marriage, she simply didn't enjoy writing letters. Whatever the case, as referenced in his letter there, after 2 years chairing Congress as its president, in October of 1777, Hancock requested a leave of absence to return home to sort his affairs in Boston and rejoin his grieving wife. As for his leadership over Congress, this was generally seen as exemplary, using all his skills as a businessman and negotiator to mediate disputes, manage finances, drum up funds, as well as help coordinate the entire effort on all fronts. In his farewell address to Congress, he stated, "Gentlemen, Friday last completed 2 years and 5 months since you did me the honor of electing me to fill this chair. As I could never flatter myself your choice proceeding from any idea of my abilities, but rather from a partial opinion of my attachment to the liberties of America, I felt myself under the strongest obligation to discharge the duties of office. I think I shall be forgiven if I say I have spared no pains, expenses, or labor to gratify your wishes and to accomplish the views of Congress." Unsurprisingly, what Hancock found in Boston upon his return was not only a hero's welcome, but also his once vaunted House of Hancock business in shambles, and the town not in much better shape. On the trade side, all but 2 of his ships were gone, with Hancock quickly selling both of these to pay off some debts, officially putting the House of Hancock out of the import-export business. He was still, however, extremely rich in real estate and had massive sums of money owed to him, but as pretty much everyone's finances were poor at this time, collecting debts wasn't exactly going well, and Hancock was not the type to force tenants and the like who couldn't pay to do so until they could. That said, it's generally thought he must have still had a good amount of money available to him even at this point, as while he had sold the remainder of his ships, he didn't bother trying to sell any of his real estate. And on top of that, ever the philanthropist as his uncle before him, among his first acts upon arriving in Boston was to provide food, clothing, and the like to widows and orphans of the war, as well as funds and supplies to help people repair their damaged homes and rebuild their lives. Naturally, from all of this and his former exemplary work leading Congress, after a few months' leave in December of 1777, he was a shoo-in to be re-elected to the Continental Congress. Upon rejoining that body in June of 1778, within a month, along with 7 other states' delegates, he signed the final completed Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution of the United States. Though noteworthy, this wouldn't be ratified until 1781. Perhaps the most critical thing of all for the war also occurred in 1778, with Congress establishing the Treaty of Alliance with France, without which the colonists would almost certainly have lost the war, as this treaty not only garnered the colonists significant direct military aid from one of the most powerful nations in the world, but also on the side, French action caused Britain to have to divert some of its manpower elsewhere in the world. This was something that was only doubled down on with regards to the issues for Britain when the British seized a Dutch ship allegedly carrying supplies to France, causing a row with the Dutch in yet another thing the British had to occupy themselves with instead of focusing on the rebellion with the colonies. This would all also culminate in the Dutch becoming the second nation after France to officially recognize the United States independence in 1782. In any event, rewinding back to July of 1778, John Hancock finally got his chance to lead a mass of troops, though unfortunately the whole thing was rather anticlimactic on this end. While you'll sometimes read that Hancock, at the head of 6,000 Massachusetts troops, suffered a major defeat owing to his bumbling attack on the British entrenched in Newport, Rhode Island, and only retaining his popularity after, thanks to the extent of his previous work in the Revolution, as well as philanthropic efforts, this isn't accurate at all. As to the real story, in a nutshell, Washington ordered General John Sullivan, a man John Adams once expressed his wish to, quote, that the first ball that had been fired had gone through Sullivan's head, to attack the British garrison in Newport. Hancock was indeed there, commanding several thousand soldiers, and by the way, Paul Revere was also there as well. but they weren't really otherwise involved in much of anything in the disaster that followed, both in that Hancock seems to have left any actual planning and commanding to the professional soldiers under his command, as well as the fact that his troops just were not really that involved because they left and went home to Boston. As to why, thanks to a major storm and some skirmishes before and directly after when scattered, the supporting French fleet under French Admiral d'Estaing was in need of repairs to many of their ships, and no amount of arguing from Sullivan's side, and Hancock reportedly also made his own attempt, could convince the admiral to remain. And thus, the French fleet departed on August the 21st for Boston. It didn't help that the assembled militia, according to Marquis de Lafayette, didn't exactly inspire confidence that they could do what they said, even if they had the fleet's help. Lafayette stated, "I have never seen a more laughable spectacle. All the tailors and apothecaries in the country must have been called out. They were mounted on bad nags and looked like a flock of ducks in crossbelts." This left Sullivan in a very precarious position, not just from the French withdrawal, but also because without French aid, any chance of succeeding in taking Newport at this point was gone. Thus, many of the militia troops, particularly those under temporary contract of just a few weeks, simply left. Likewise, Hancock and his army also withdrew as there was no point in hanging around anymore, with he and his men back home in Boston by August the 26th. In the aftermath, the very much needed relationship with France was extremely strained, with the American public being less than kind, to put it mildly, in the press and the like with regards to the French and their actions on this one, generally blaming them and their alleged cowardice for the failure of the campaign. Once again showing his skills as a diplomat and mediator, Hancock tried to restore friendly relations, in this case putting together both a formal dinner and subsequent reception at Faneuil Hall for the French Admiral and Lafayette and their officers, with most of Boston's leading citizens in attendance as well. Fast forwarding about a year later, John Adams was recalled from France to Massachusetts in August of 1779 and returned to being a private citizen briefly, though only a week later was appointed to draft a new constitution for the state, ultimately in the span of just a couple months writing what would become, to this day, the oldest still functioning codified constitution, which not coincidentally heavily influenced the United States Constitution, the second oldest still functioning codified constitution. For more on all this, see our video, The Key to Humans Humaning. But as to our story today, with the new Massachusetts Constitution ratified on June the 15th, 1780, and going into effect in October of that year, the people of Massachusetts were in need of a governor, and if you've been following along in our Hancock series and guessed John Hancock, one of the most popular men in all of the colonies, would be elected in a landslide as the state's first governor, you'd be correct, with Hancock assuming that role on October the 25th, 1780, after getting an astounding approximately 90% of the votes. Unfortunately for Hancock at this time, while he was continually re-elected up through 1785, when he'd switched to become the President of the United States under the Articles of Confederation, like his father and uncle before him, his health was rapidly in decline despite only being in his 40s. As to what ailed him, as seemingly ran in his family, he suffered from occasional severe bouts of gout that would leave him bedridden. Nevertheless, he soldiered on, and while still governor of Massachusetts, the peace with the British was announced in 1783. Hancock, who had sacrificed much of his fortune and was among the first the British targeted to hang for treason should the war have gone the other way, would express his relief, writing after he found out, "I have not the vanity to think that I have been of very extensive service in our late unhappy contest, but one thing I can truly boast, I set out upon honest principles and strictly adhered to them to the close of the contest. I have lost many thousands sterling, but thank God my country is saved, and by the smile of heaven I am a free and independent man." His work for the nation was not done, however, and despite victory, now without the British threat uniting them, the states of the Confederation were on the verge of falling completely apart, with many even regularly violating the terms of the treaty with the British, which could have had catastrophic consequences if allowed to continue. Something needed to be done rapidly. We'll conclude this tale in our next and final video in this series, Hancock United at Last. With a peace treaty finally announced in 1783 and his life no longer forfeit if the British prevailed, when he wasn't battling health issues, including severe issues with gout, John Hancock was otherwise governing the state of Massachusetts. It was in this role in 1785 when he was once again voted in as President of Congress, technically making him the first president of the United States to be elected to 2 non-consecutive terms, given his former role as president of Congress during the early going of the war. Unfortunately, his health had deteriorated too much at this point, and he was unable to make the trip to Philadelphia to take office there directly. To add insult to injury, shortly after being elected, his 10-year-old son died in an ice skating accident in January of 1786. For reference, his only other child, a daughter Lydia, had also previously died as a baby about 10 years before this. Health poor, he finally resigned as president on June 6, 1786. But his work was not quite done for the United States, having one more critical role to play. As we've covered in great depth in our video, The Key to Humans Humaning, after John Adams, Ben Franklin and co. successfully negotiated the end of the American Revolution with the Treaty of Paris, signed by both sides on September 3, 1783, the United States had a major problem. Despite the name, its states were not exactly actually united, generally out to serve their own interests first, and, if convenient, those of their loose union. During the war, this was less of a problem as they had pressing need to work together. Now they didn't. Not only that, but in their quest to make a central government that was as purposefully weak as possible so as never to come to dominate in the way their former government did over them, they had gone too far, creating a government in the Articles of Confederation, or the so-called League of Friendship, that had, as George Washington so famously put, no money, and no real way to get any outside of printing some that was worthless. This was a rather glaring issue for countless reasons, right down to the then complete inability for the government to pay its debts, or its soldiers, or for anything at all, really. The central government also had very little power it could exert over the states, or make anything happen in many cases unless all the states agreed on it, which was an extreme rarity. This was a major immediate problem when considering, for example, the aforementioned Treaty of Paris between Britain and the United States that ended the war and gave incredibly favorable terms to the new country. The issue was many of the states saw little need to adhere to the treaty, and indeed were not, and there was very little the federal government could do about it. This could have potentially blown up in the young nation's face had Britain decided to also go back on the deal, potentially plunging the nation right back into a war it could not afford against a still very superior adversary, and this time perhaps not seeing the French have the United States' back after the US kind of threw them under the bus in negotiations with the British. In short, Congress had no real power to govern anything, the states knew it, and at a certain point, it even mostly ceased trying. All of this had been done very intentionally, giving the political minds among the colonists knew well most such attempts at similar governments in the past had ultimately devolved into some form of tyranny, whether tyranny of the majority or by those placed in power, regardless of what any laws put in place said. Not just in governments far afield or in the past, but this was something they themselves had seen with some of the then state legislatures abusing their positions in the colonies. George Washington would write of all this, "We have probably had too great an opinion of human nature in forming our confederation." And he further states the government they had made was a shadow without substance. Thus, it became clear to all that the Articles needed, at the very least, amended heavily if the nation in some form was to survive at all. After some deliberation about this, it was decided to convene to fix the problem with delegates from each state selected to represent the people in these changes, with 70 delegates from the 13 states selected, of which 55 ultimately attended the convention. Once there, they ultimately decided instead of modifying the Articles of Confederation, they would instead just come up with a brand new constitution. If you'd like full details on the surprisingly interesting saga of the development of the US Constitution and just how revolutionary it was at the time, which is often lost on us in modern times, do go check out our video, The Key to Humans Humaning, after you're done watching this video. But suffice it to say for now, after a whole lot of hot and sweaty political wrangling shut up, quite literally with windows closed and all to stop eavesdropping, in the summer of 1787, enough delegates, 39, were willing to sign the completed document that they came up with to approve it, despite that pretty much everyone had issues with elements of it. And so it was that the United States had a shiny new proposed constitution. After everyone signed, Ben Franklin would muse while looking at a painting of the sun on the chair George Washington, who had presided over the assembly, sat in. Often in the course of the session and the vicissitudes of my hopes and fears as to its issue, I looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now, at length, I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. As to what happened after they all signed, according to George Washington, the remaining delegates all went out to the city tavern and had a party. It was done. Well, almost. It still needed ratified by the states to become official. When it was put before Massachusetts, however, the issue of whether to ratify it was highly contentious despite its extreme similarity to the Massachusetts Constitution from which it was partially based. Once again, going back to the Articles of Confederation, many within the states at the time heavily favored independence and a loose coalition and a weak central power uniting them. The new Constitution was proposing the opposite of that. Others were caught up in various details of it, everything from the term length for those elected, to it not including a Bill of Rights initially, to it not abolishing slavery as the Massachusetts Constitution had done via John Adams' inclusion of a Declaration of Rights, which critically had, at the start, all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, among which may be reckoned the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, that of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, in fine, that of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness. All of these arguments were basically the same that had been made in the United States Constitution's drafting, but they went ahead with it anyway. As Ben Franklin would sum up when the document was originally approved, there are several parts of this Constitution which I do not at present approve. I doubt, too, whether any convention we can obtain may be able to make a better Constitution. For when you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, and their selfish views. From such an assembly can a perfect production be expected? It therefore astonishes me to find this system approaching so near to perfection as it does. Thus I consent to this Constitution because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best. Going back to Massachusetts, when the ratifying convention first met in January of 1788, Hancock was naturally elected president of the convention, despite his ailing health, which initially prevented him from attending the debates. As for his opinion on it all, he kept his cards very close to his chest, including when he was first presented a copy of the proposed new constitution. He stated it was not for him, to quote, to decide upon this momentous affair. However, in the early going, rumors swirled that Hancock opposed the measure, allegedly in no small part as it diminished his power as governor in some ways via putting a more powerful federal government over him. Other prominent individuals, such as Lieutenant Governor Samuel Adams, also seemed to be leaning that way too in the early going, though he would change his mind in the end. But before that, Samuel Adams would write to Richard Henry Lee on December the 5th, 1787, I confess, as I enter the building, I stumble at the threshold. I meet with a national government instead of a federal union of sovereign states. I am unable to conceive why the wisdom of the convention led them to give the preference to the former before the latter. If several states in the union are to become one entire nation under one legislature, the powers of which shall extend to every subject of legislation and its laws be supreme and control the whole, the idea of sovereignty in these states must be lost. With it seeming like ratification would not go through, Hancock finally did attend, having his servants carry him to the hall reportedly wrapped in flannels. There, on February the 6th, he gave a speech before the vote, throwing his support wholeheartedly behind ratification, stating, I am happy that my health has been so far restored that I am rendered able to meet my fellow citizens as represented in this convention. I should have considered it as one of the most distressing misfortunes of my life to be deprived of giving my aid and support to a system which cannot fail to give the people of the United States a greater degree of political freedom, and eventually as much national dignity as falls to the lot of any nation on earth. That a general system of government is indispensably necessary to save our country from ruin is agreed upon all sides. That the one now to be decided upon has its defects, all agree. But when we consider the variety of interests and the different habits of the men it is intended for, it would be very singular to have an entire union of sentiment respecting it. But as the matter now stands, the powers reserved by the people render them secure, and until they themselves become corrupt, they will always have upright and able rulers. I give my assent to the Constitution. The question now before you is, such as no nation on earth, without the limits of America, has ever had the privilege of deciding upon, as the supreme ruler of the universe has seen fit to bestow upon us this glorious opportunity, let us decide upon it, appealing to him for the rectitude of our intentions, and in humble confidence that he will yet continue to bless and save our country. When the votes were ultimately cast shortly after the speech, of the 355 voters, only 19 more were in favor of ratification versus against. With how close this ended up being, seeing many credit Hancock choosing to side with those in favor, swaying the outcome. In the aftermath, Poor health or not, Hancock's popularity was still about as high as it could be among the masses, and he easily continued to win election after election as governor of Massachusetts. Had it not been for his health, given his relatively young age and extreme popularity in the new United States, in all likelihood, John Hancock would have had a decent shot at pulling off the trifecta of not just president of the Continental Congress and then president under the Articles of Confederation, but also president under the new United States Constitution at some point. Though, of course, Washington winning the first election was all but inevitable, and no one was surprised by that outcome. Speaking of that first election, well, as was the custom of the time, Hancock did not campaign or even express overt interest in the office of the presidency. He did receive 4 electoral college votes anyway, 2 from Pennsylvania and 1 each from Virginia and South Carolina, and likely would have received significantly more if not for his boyhood friend in John Adams taking all the Massachusetts electoral votes, with Adams ultimately becoming vice president to George Washington partially because of it in 1789, and later the second president of the United States in 1797. But whether Hancock might have secured the role for himself at some point or not, it was not to be, as his health continued its rapid decline despite his relatively young age. Ultimately, John Hancock would pass away on October the 8th, 1793, at the age of only 56. Over 20,000 people attended his funeral, about 1 in 200 people in the United States at the time, and the date was ordered by now Massachusetts Governor Samuel Adams to be a state holiday. Hancock's final resting place is next to his Uncle Thomas at the Old Granary Burial Grounds in Boston. Now, if you followed along in this 5-part series, you might at this point be thinking it seems a rather odd thing that the likes of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and their many prominent cohorts would be so lauded in the aftermath, yet John Hancock was largely forgotten in popular history outside of his famous signature. As one of his biographers, Harlow Unger, would write, John Hancock's transformation from Tory patrician to fiery rebel is one of the least known stories of the Revolution, yet he was perhaps the consummate American hero. Even John Adams in 1809 had already observed this trend and lamented that both Samuel Adams and John Hancock, 2 of the biggest players in the early Revolution, had been so shunted to the side and, to quote Adams, almost buried in oblivion. So what happened? Well, as we can attest in doing our 5-video deep dive on the man, outside of countless letters pertaining to business transactions and later similar administrative letters during the Revolution, Hancock did not actually leave much in the way of personal writings for historians to gauge his thoughts, motivations, and perspectives, as so many others of the Founding Fathers did. Most prominently, arguably, John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams, who kept daily journals for huge portions of their lives, covering everything that was going on around them in their daily lives. The power of this is that it allows historians to view events and decisions from the individual's perspective to contrast from those of their political enemies and others speaking about them. Now, if you enjoy reading about business transactions and administration, you'll love diving into the John Hancock archives. But otherwise, he left relatively little of the rest, leaving most of what's said about him we remember today being written by his opposition in politics. And of this, while most describe him as an extremely able administrator and moderator of disputes, his propensity for insanely foppish dress and his perceived vanity from all this did not exactly endear him to many of the other leaders on a personal level. Given this type of excess and his extreme wealth were generally seen as contrary to the Republican ideals they were all fighting for. Further, at least by their accounts, and to be fair, you can see where it comes through in some of his own personal writings that have survived, he also seems to have enjoyed to an extreme degree his popularity with the masses. In a nutshell, he seems to have liked being famous, which was also seen as anti-Republican to revel in such things openly. This is partially why in the early going in the United States, it was tradition to not really promote yourself when running for offices like that of the president, but simply to let it be known you'd accept the position if elected, and then allow your constituents to take it from there. And even if you were elected, it was expected you'd say something like, you didn't feel qualified for the job and you didn't really want it anyway, even though in most cases the opposite was very clearly true. You just couldn't say that. Thus, Hancock's more open ambition, fancy dress, perceived vanity, and excessive wealth worked against his reputation with, ironically, the other elite. As James Madison would state, Hancock is weak, ambitious, a courtier of popularity given to low intrigue. This about a man who was among the first to publicly call the colonists to fight and was steadfast in this in the early going when it was most likely to see him get hung for it. And he also had everything to lose in his immense fortune as well, even if he wasn't arrested and executed for treason. sure doesn't seem weak at all. Sam Adams would also chime in, writing of the celebration Hancock held after he became governor of Massachusetts. John Hancock appears in public with all the pageantry of an oriental prince. He rides in an elegant chariot. He is attended by 4 servants dressed in superb livery, mounted on fine horses richly caparisoned, and escorted by 50 horsemen with drawn sabers, the one half of whom precede and the other follow his carriage. In stark contrast, and amazingly ironic if you really think about it, the masses on the whole seem to adore John Hancock thanks to his extreme philanthropy and generous nature, amiable personality, not just towards the elite, but to the masses at any station in life, his skill as an administrator during the Revolution, which was critical to its early success, and his bold patriotism despite what this cost him in a number of ways when so many others in similar positions sided with the British. In short, the masses seem to have had an entirely different opinion of the man, and there's a reason in the early going of the war there were rallying cries of King Hancock. But those masses died off, and historians, with very little to work with directly from the man, mostly only accounts from his political opponents, and with much of his more significant role in the revolution being in helping to start it and, in the early going, administer it. Well, let's just say writing letters to convince some governmental body or individual to send more troops or resources, or arranging the funding and outfitting of the ship that sent the first diplomat to France to get that crucial aid there is not exactly as sexy as winning a major battle or drafting the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. Never mind the fact that if Hancock had not played such a prominent role in igniting the revolution in the first place, and then figuring out how to keep it going via his rather mundane administrative and mediating work, those major battle victories and everything after would not have happened. As historian Charles Akers would sum up, the chief victim of Massachusetts historiography has been John Hancock, the most gifted and popular politician in the Bay State's long history. He suffered the misfortune of being known to later generations almost entirely through the judgments of his detractors, Tory and Whig. But perhaps John Adams, one of the most distinguished of all of his era and who knew John Hancock from boyhood, would sum him up best, writing about Hancock a couple decades after Hancock's death, lamenting the way history remembered him, stating in 1812, "When will the character of Hancock be understood? Never. I could melt into tears when I hear his name. The property he possessed when his country called him would purchase Washington and Franklin both. If benevolence, charity, generosity were ever personified in North America, they were in John Hancock. What shall I say of his education, his literary acquisitions, his travels, his military, civil, and political services, his sufferings and sacrifices? I can say with truth that I profoundly admired him and more profoundly loved him." 5 years later, in 1817, Adams would expound upon all this considerably, writing, "I knew Mr. Hancock from his cradle to his grave. He was radically generous and benevolent. What shall I say of his fortune, his ships? At the time, not less than 1,000 families were, every day in the year, dependent on Mr. Hancock for their daily bread. Consider his real estate in Boston, in the country, in Connecticut, and the rest of New England. Had Mr. Hancock fallen asleep to this day, he would now awake one of the richest men. Had he persevered in business as a private merchant, he might have erected a house of Medicis, but no man's property was ever more entirely devoted to the public. The town had chosen Mr. Hancock into the legislature of the province. His mind was soon engrossed by public cares, alarms, and terrors. His business was left to subalterns, his private affairs neglected, and continued to be so to the end of his life." Adams concludes on John Hancock, "Though I never injured or justly offended him, and though I spent much of my time and suffered unknown anxiety in defending his property, reputation, and liberty from persecution, I cannot but reflect upon myself for not paying him more respect than I did in his lifetime. But if statues, obelisks, pyramids, or divine honors were ever merited by men of cities or nation, John Hancock deserved these from the United States." James Otis, Samuel Adams, and John Hancock were the 3 most essential characters in the Revolution, and Great Britain knew it, though America does not. Great and important and excellent characters aroused and excited by these arose in Pennsylvania, Virginia, New York, South Carolina, and in all the other states, but these 3 were the first movers, the most constant, steady, persevering springs, agents, and most disinterested sufferers and firmest pillars of the whole revolution.